At the foot of the Caucasus, where stone mountains are pressed against the Caspian Sea until the world is reduced to a narrow slit, there stands a wall that does not sit outside history, but cuts straight through it. In Derbent, the city did not grow around the wall. The wall itself decided how far people were allowed to go and where they were forced to stop. For centuries, people believed it was Alexander the Great himself who ordered this wall built to seal away Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic tribes said to be waiting for the day they would spill into the human world. What is strange is that the story does not belong to a single culture. It appears nearly unchanged in Jewish, Christian and Islamic tradition alike. So what in Derbent compelled history itself to tell the same fear over and over again? Derbent is not a place where someone happened to build a wall and only later invented a story to explain it. Everything here begins with the land itself. Between the jagged spine of the Caucasus Mountains and the vast expanse of the Caspian Sea lies a natural corridor so narrow that, in places, it measures less than 2 miles across. For thousands of years, this was the only passage through which nomadic tribes from the Eurasian steppe could move south into the wealthy worlds of Persia and the Middle East. Whoever controlled this gap decided who was allowed to enter civilization and who was kept out. The walls of Derbent were built for that exact purpose. From the fortress of Narinkala, set high on the hill above the city, 2 massive stone walls extend outward like open arms. They run for more than 2 miles, rising as high as 65 feet, nearly 13 feet thick, descending in straight lines from the mountainside to the edge of the Caspian Sea. To the west, another line of fortifications continues deep into the Caucasus for dozens of miles, linking watchtowers, forts and garrisons into a continuous defensive system. Not a single monument, but an entire landscape shaped for war. These were not symbolic walls. They were built to endure real conflict. The core of the system was completed in the 5th and 6th centuries under the Sassanid Empire, using precise stonework, deep foundations and designs meant to sustain permanent military occupation. Contemporary records suggest that even the Byzantine Empire paid gold to keep the defences operational, knowing that if Derbent fell, the northern gate of the entire region would stand open. Below the fortress, the city of Derbent has been inhabited since at least the 8th century BCE. The Persians called it Darband, the closed gate. The Arabs knew it as Bab al-Abwab, the gate of gates. These names are not poetic metaphors, they describe a concrete reality. Here, history does not flow freely. It is narrowed, restrained, and forced to pass through stone. And then the contradiction appears. Because once the layers of myth are peeled away from the stone, Alexander the Great almost certainly was not the builder of these walls. Alexander passed through the Caucasus in the 4th century BCE, while most of the defensive system at Derbent, as we see it today, was constructed nearly a millennium later under the Sassanids. No ancient text describes Alexander ordering a massive stone fortification here. No archaeological evidence directly links his name to Narinkala or to the walls stretching down to the sea, and yet the legend endured, and not in isolation. Across Jewish, Christian and Islamic scripture, the same story repeats. A great king travels to the edge of the civilized world and builds a wall between 2 mountains to seal away Gog and Magog, forces of chaos destined to break loose at the end of time. In the Quran, this figure is called Dhu al-Qarnayn, the one with 2 horns, and his wall is described as being made of iron and molten copper. Those materials do not match the limestone and sandstone of Derbent, but the landscape does, with unsettling precision. So what drew a real military structure into the centre of apocalyptic myth? The answer may lie in lived experience, specifically in the view northward. For ancient Persian and Middle Eastern societies, nomadic tribes were not enemies in a conventional political sense. They arrived without warning. No cities, no treaties, no clear intentions. Huns, Turks, Mongols surged south like natural disasters, leaving scorched land and shattered populations behind. For settled civilizations, this was not merely war. It was the sensation that order itself could collapse. In that context, the wall at Derbent did more than block invaders. It stood against the fear that the familiar world could simply end. And when that fear demanded a story in order to endure, history and myth fused, transforming a line of stone defences into an apocalyptic wall in the shared memory of multiple civilizations. If Alexander did not build it, then who does this wall truly belong to? A cautious answer suggests that the truth lies with the empires that sustained it. For the Sassanids, Derbent was more than a military installation. It was a declaration of order. By erecting a physical boundary at the narrowest point of the continent, they turned geography into politics, and politics into fate. Linking the structure to Alexander, the ultimate symbol of universal power and conquest, may have been a way to legitimize their own role as heirs to a world order they claimed to defend. Another explanation runs deeper into culture and memory. Perhaps the Wall of Alexander was never a precise location at all. It was a collective memory anchored to any structure large enough, imposing enough, and distant enough to stand at the edge of the known world. As generations endured repeated incursions from the north, that memory ceased to be recorded as chronicle and survived instead as myth. Gog and Magog, in this reading, are not literal beings but embodiments of uncontrollable chaos, war, migration, collapse. There is also a quieter, more elusive hypothesis that the system at Derbent was not built from nothing. Some scholars ask whether the Sassanids may have expanded or repurposed an older line of defense, one that has since vanished from the archaeological record. If so, the legend of a mythical king sealing a passage between two mountains could be the faint echo of a memory older than the empires we can still name. No single theory is strong enough to close the story, but it is precisely this layering of power, memory, and fear that makes the wall at Derbent belong to no one alone. It belongs to all those who believed that the world had to be held back in order for it to endure. Perhaps the wall at Derbent was never meant to imprison monsters or to await the end of days. What it may have contained instead was something far more enduring, humanity's deepest fear that the order we call civilization survives only by fragile boundaries. And if those boundaries were to fail, what would truly cross over first? Just a few miles from Bulgaria's crowded beaches, the Stranja oak forest swallows sound. Damp leaf litter gives underfoot. The air carries a raw resin tang. Mosquitoes hover close. Then beneath the canopy, Beglik Tash appears, an ancient stone sanctuary tied to the Thracians since the Bronze Age. What's strange is how completely this place once vanished from public view. Under communism, Beglik Tash was sealed inside Perla, an official's hunting and holiday compound. No signs, no entrance, no story. So why hide a sacred site? And what exactly did the stone agree to keep quiet? Go deeper. And Beglik Tash doesn't feel like a temple that was built. It feels like a ritual written into a root. The path bends around oak roots. In places, it slicks over with moss. Insects cling and follow, as if to remind you, you are entering nature's territory, not a tourist stage. Then the boulders arrive, sudden, immense, like they were placed here before anyone knew how to keep records. Much of it is natural, volcanic rock, split along its grain, worn by wind and time. But the old builders didn't break stone to raise walls. They chose the right cluster, then intervened with restraint. A flattened surface for offerings, A few grooves and holes that read like traces of ceremony, an open space that works as a gathering ground. Nothing here conquers the forest. Instead, the forest is promoted, elevated into a temple. And then comes the best-known test, a narrow cleft, almost a maze. Cold stone presses close to your shoulders. Your breathing tightens because the space leaves no room to perform. Legend says only the righteous can pass through to receive ancestral wisdom. But standing at that slit of rock, the real question feels simpler. Can you stay calm enough to step in when you can't pretend to be strong? Beyond it is the marriage bed, where ritual speaks of the joining of sun and earth, fertility, balance, continuity. Then Apostle Tash forces a halt. A massive stone balanced on a small support shaped like a heart or a hand. You circle it, searching for a visual answer. It does not offer one. It simply stands there, as if Beglik Tash is asking you to learn a harder skill. How to live beside what you do not yet understand. But just when everything starts to feel like it makes sense, Beglik Tash introduces a contradiction. If this is only natural stone shaped by chance, why does the space feel so guided? Why does the route slow you down, the narrow cleft make you shrink inward? The stopping points make a group lower its voice without being told, like you've entered something forbidden. The next contradiction is in the cuts. Some stones appear split in a way that makes your eyes react instantly. Too clean, too straight, too much like a tool was involved. In certain angles of light, faint parallel lines on the surface can look like the trace of a blade. Instinct wants to say, this doesn't belong to the Bronze Age. And that is the most dangerous moment, when imagination runs faster than evidence. Then reason pulls you back. Rock can fracture along weak planes. Weathering can smooth an edge. Light and shadow can trick the eye. Human vision is drawn to straight lines because they feel like a signature. In a place already charged with sacred meaning, the brain is even quicker to supply a story that satisfies its hunger for explanation. And there is another contradiction, quieter but deeper, the historical blank. There is no manual that tells us precisely which rites unfolded here, who directed them, or how long Beglik Tash served any one community. There may once have been oral memory, and time erased it. A portion of the story may have been sealed during the Perla years. When the record has holes, hypotheses grow faster than truth, while Beglik Tash stands in the forest as a question that refuses to close. The strongest theory is also the simplest. Beglik Tash began as a remarkable natural formation, stones with a presence, recognized by the Thracians and other ancient communities as a place fit for rite. They didn't need a monumental building. They needed a stony stage where people could gather, look up into the sky, and believe there was an order larger than daily life. Small interventions, a surface for offerings, grooves, holes, were enough to turn landscape into ceremony. A second line of thought is more alluring, an astronomical sanctuary. The narrow passages and openings may have been used to watch sunlight shift through the seasons. Summer solstice, winter solstice, planting, harvest. Time measured not in minutes, but in cycles of survival. If that is true, Beglik Tash is not only a holy place, it is a community's clock, where light itself becomes a reminder of fertility and of human limits. And, inevitably, there is the theory out at the edge. Lost techniques, unusual tools, a kind of knowledge we no longer carry. The flat cuts and parallel marks invite it because they satisfy a very modern obsession. Maybe the ancestors knew more than we think. Even if you don't choose to believe it, the pull of that idea remains because it grows from something real, the feeling of being challenged by stone. At dusk, from higher ground, the Black Sea in the distance feels like the world exhaling. Beglik Tash stays silent. Is it a temple of stone or a temple of the human mind, confronting stone. And if this place was locked away for decades, what stayed locked longer? The site or our faith?
Beneath the quiet ground we walk every day, entire worlds are hidden. Colossal chambers carved as if by unseen hands, tunnels spiraling into darkness with no beginning, no end, and megastructures so precise they defy the tools of their time. They were sealed, abandoned, or forgotten. Yet their walls whisper of something vast, purposeful, and unsettling. Why did ancient builders carve downward instead of upward? Why do so many of these places show signs of planning without explanation, engineering without context, and secrets without answers? As we descend into the earth, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Someone built these places for a reason. And whatever that reason was, they never wanted it revealed. Wieliczka salt mine. Beneath the quiet contours of southern Poland, the Wieliczka salt mine stretches into the earth like a vast inverted cathedral carved over centuries. Its origins in the medieval search for precious brine, gradually transforming into a subterranean world where geology and human persistence intertwine in a dim clarity that feels older than recorded memory. And as one descends through corridors darkened by time, but smoothed by generations of hands, the air thickens with the mineral scent of ancient seas trapped in stone, hinting that these depths once lay under waters that have long since receded, leaving behind a landscape that miners shaped into chambers, chapels, and vaulted halls, whose crystalline sculptures catch the faintest glimmer of lamplight as though they were meant to hold something unspoken. And while the early shafts reveal pragmatic engineering, timber supports blackened by salt, spiral staircases cut with restrained efficiency, and mining tools abandoned mid-century, the deeper levels begin to offer forms that stray from mere extraction, where chambers expand into improbable symmetry, their ceilings supported by pillars that seem too refined for the harsh working conditions that birthed them, blending functional necessity with a shadow of aesthetic intention, as if the miners were responding not only to the demands of labor, but also to a quiet impulse to leave behind markers of their presence in these silent halls. And in the St. Kinga Chapel, where entire altarpieces, reliefs, and chandeliers are carved from salt, the mine's story shifts, suggesting that the boundary between sacred devotion and geological wonder was porous, for the mineral itself became a medium through which artisans expressed narratives that once existed only above ground, raising questions about how such elaborate craftsmanship persisted in an environment known for its dangers, collapses, toxic vapors, and the ever-present risks of deep mining. Yet these works endure with a stillness that conveys both the resilience of faith and the patience of stone. Surrounding tunnels diverge like the spokes of a forgotten wheel, their walls bearing tool marks that repeat with rhythmic regularity until they fade into more erratic patterns where the structure of the salt altered, as though the miners encountered pockets of unexpected hardness or cavities that forced them to adapt. And in some places, the corridors widen into reservoirs of brackish water, whose glassy surfaces reflect the void above so perfectly that they distort one's sense of orientation, creating impressions of hidden depth that invite speculation about natural chambers lying beyond surveyed boundaries. And as historians attempt to reconcile legends of labyrinthine extensions with the documented engineering of the mine, they find occasional anomalies. Shafts sealed long before official records mention them, stairways that descend to levels without clear purpose, and isolated pockets of air where sound behaves strangely, dampened in some corners and amplified in others, as though the geometry of these spaces interacts with acoustics in ways that have yet to be fully understood, prompting discussions about whether the earliest miners inherited older cavities formed by retreating seas or exploited natural weaknesses in the salt that left traces unlike typical human workmanship. Geological studies reveal layered structures showing the slow crystallization of evaporated marine basins, their stratification interrupted by subtle distortions, hinting at ancient tectonic movements that might have opened hollows now lost behind collapsed walls. And these traces, while scientifically explainable, often inspire comparisons to the mine's more enigmatic sections, where chambers align in patterns that seem almost intentional, following vectors that do not correspond neatly to economic extraction paths, raising the possibility that practical mining occasionally converge with pre-existing voids shaped by forces predating any cultural activity in the region. And although most theories rest firmly on known mining practices, the coexistence of sacred art, engineering precision, and unexplained irregularities leaves room for contemplation about how deeply human hands and geological history intertwine. For the mine's oldest passages echo faintly with the interplay of need, belief, and circumstance, leaving behind a structure that feels simultaneously crafted and discovered, as if the deeper one travels, the more indistinct the boundary becomes between what was carved intentionally and what presented itself as a natural guide. And when the journey returns upward toward the surface, the transition from echoing halls to daylight reinforces the lingering impression that the mine's vast interior harbors more than its documented past reveals, not in the sense of hidden treasures or uncharted kingdoms, but in the quiet suggestion that some ancient environments resist complete interpretation, preserving within their mineral silence a reminder that even in places mapped and measured, something of the Earth's older story remains just beyond the reach of certainty. Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni. Deep beneath the modest streets of Paola, the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni descends through layers of Maltese limestone in a series of chambers whose shifting light and quiet curvature suggest an intention both practical and ineffably ceremonial, beginning with the upper level where rough-hewn cavities echo the island's earliest attempts to create sheltered spaces and gradually giving way to lower rooms carved with a refinement that seems to respond not only to engineering needs, but to an evolving sense of spatial meaning, for the walls soften into sweeping arcs and recessed niches that catch shadow in measured gradients, hinting at a community attentive to the subtle dialogue between stone and silence. And while the first excavators expected little more than a storage complex or simple burial ground, they found instead a layered architectural sequence whose design principles appear neither haphazard nor purely utilitarian, with entrances aligned in ways that control illumination, floors sculpted to shape movement, and ceilings fashioned in a red ochre swirl that mirrors the decorative vocabulary of Malta's above-ground megalithic temples, though here the patterns feel more intimate, their pigment lingering like faint memory in an air so still it seems to have settled over millennia. Deeper rooms introduce a different character, particularly the so-called oracle chamber, where the carved curves of its walls generate a curious acoustic resonance that causes low tones to vibrate beyond expectation, a phenomenon documented in modern tests, yet difficult to fully explain because the chamber's shape does not cleanly match known resonant geometries, raising questions about whether the effect was an intentional feature of ritual practice or a fortunate accident subsequently woven into the site's social meaning, and, in either case, the amplified hum suggests that sound once played a role here, shaping the experience of those who moved through its dim passages. Nearby, the decorated room presents a level of craftsmanship that contrasts with the rougher niches above, its surfaces worked into rhythmic indentations, reminiscent of architectural motifs found in the island's freestanding temples, though their purpose underground remains elusive, for no tools survive to clarify the methods used, and no inscriptions offer directives, leaving archaeologists to piece together interpretations from fragmentary clues such as scattered human remains, beads of shell and stone, and traces of pigment whose origin cannot always be securely identified, creating a patchwork of evidence that hints at funerary customs, transitional rites, or perhaps communal gatherings responding to the shifting obligations of a prehistoric island society. And yet, contradictions appear amid these readings, for the Hypogeum's spatial organization seems too complex for a site used solely as a necropolis, its passageways branching in ways that suggest controlled access, its chambers arranged with an attention to flow rather than simple storage, and its expansions carried out across phases that indicate evolving priorities, as though generations returned not merely to enter the dead, but to engage with a place already imbued with significance, adapting it to new practices even as its original intentions faded from collective memory. The discovery of small carved figurines, including the reclining, sleeping lady, deepens the puzzle by offering glimpses of a symbolic world difficult to parse. For while the figure is often associated with dreams, death, or regeneration, Its context within the Hypogeum raises additional possibilities, such as the representation of a revered ancestor, a guardian of transitional states, or an embodiment of the island's broader ritual landscape, yet none of these hypotheses resolve fully with the stratigraphy of the chambers, where certain levels show signs of intense use, while others suggest periods of abandonment or repurposing without clear cause. Geological examinations reveal that the limestone layers here vary in density and fossil content, factors that may have influenced the choice of where to carve particular rooms. And in places the stone reveals natural fissures that seem to have guided the extension of certain passages, prompting speculation that the earliest builders may have been responding to pre-existing cracks or natural cavities that are now obscured by later modifications. And such hints encourage a broader view in which the Hypogeum represents not a sudden undertaking, but a long dialogue with the subterranean landscape, evolving as the community's relationship with the earth deepened, faded, or changed direction. Still, the absence of definitive evidence allows alternative readings to persist, including the notion that some rooms served as auditory chambers for rites involving chanting or percussion, or that the lower levels' labyrinthine quality served to restrict access to those versed in a particular cosmology, with turns designed to disorient, soften light, or prepare individuals for encounters with spaces regarded as thresholds between worlds, interpretations that remain cautious yet difficult to dismiss given the site's sensory qualities. And when considering the full structure, its irregular yet purposeful geometry, its mix of rough and refined spaces, its combinations of burial remains and architectural sophistication, researchers often conclude that the Hypogeum may reflect a convergence of functions, a repository of ancestors, a locus of ritual, and a symbolic descent into the island's deeper geological memory, each layer shaped by the hands of people whose intentions can only be glimpsed through the material echoes they left behind. And as one emerges once more into daylight after tracing the downward turns of the site, the impressions of shadow, sound, and carved stone linger with an understated suggestion that the Hypogeum's most compelling qualities lie not in hidden chambers or undiscovered artifacts, but in the way its quiet architecture sustains an unresolved dialogue between human purpose and geological time, leaving the sense that something essential about its origins remains just beneath the surface of understanding, waiting in the dim contour of its carved walls for the next careful attempt to interpret their meaning. Longyou Caves. Hidden beneath the rolling landscape of Zhejiang, the Longyou Caves open into vast chambers whose sheer scale and mathematical precision feel unexpectedly deliberate, beginning with quiet descents where the first impressions are of monumental emptiness rather than ornament, the walls rising in near vertical planes covered in parallel chisel marks that run with such consistent rhythm they create the impression of a single continuous gesture frozen across stone. And as the eye adjusts to the dimness, the immense dimensions resolve. Aisles as tall as multi-story buildings, pillars placed with careful spacing, ceilings carved into broad planes, interrupted by sweeping arcs that seem to follow an internal logic, yet resist simple classification as engineering, for the caves lack any surviving tools, debris, or inscriptions that might anchor them to a known historical moment. And although the current understanding ties their excavation to the late Warring States or early Han period, the absence of clear evidence leaves room for measured uncertainty. For the caves present neither the typical mining traces nor the architectural cues of ritual spaces, instead emerging as hybrid interiors whose purpose must be inferred from form alone. And this form reveals halls that mirror one another in scale but differ subtly in geometry, as though multiple teams worked from a shared plan, but introduced local adaptations responding to the stone's texture, water seepage, or structural needs, creating variations that complicate any assumption of central coordination. Geological surveys show that the soft sandstone of the region lends itself to large-scale excavation, yet the cave's survival over 2 millennia suggests an understanding of load distribution that goes beyond trial and error, for the thick pillars and carefully angled ceilings distribute pressure with unexpected sophistication, raising questions about whether their builders possessed empirical knowledge accumulated over generations, or whether they drew inspiration from now lost architectural traditions. The cave's internal surfaces, marked by the repeated herringbone-like striations, are often interpreted as the result of quarrying techniques. Yet the aesthetic regularity of these marks has prompted speculation that their pattern may have held symbolic or practical significance, perhaps aiding in acoustics, drainage, or even internal illumination, though none of these hypotheses resolves fully when tested against the varied chambers, some of which show slight deviations in the angle and depth of the grooves, as though the workers shifted technique in response to unseen constraints. Small ledges, platforms, and recesses appear irregularly along the walls, their placements not always symmetrical or functionally obvious, suggesting either incomplete work, adaptations to natural inclusions in the stone, or the remains of features now lost, such as wooden structures or water management systems, that might have once occupied the interiors, and yet no residues or fastening points provide definitive clues, leaving archaeologists to weigh competing interpretations without clear resolution. One cave contains pools of still water that reflect the ceiling. In such perfect clarity, they appear like inverted chambers, and these mirrors of stone and shadow contribute to the broader sense that the caves were never solely utilitarian, though their lack of explicit ceremonial markers challenges arguments for a purely ritualistic purpose. And the hydrological stability of these pools further complicates the picture, for their longevity implies an understanding of groundwater dynamics uncommon in simple quarry operations. Local legends describe the caves as the work of supernatural beings or forgotten dynastic efforts, but while such stories preserve cultural memory, they cannot substitute for stratigraphic evidence, which remains sparse due to centuries of water flow, human reuse, and the absence of datable materials. And this scarcity has encouraged some researchers to consider whether the caves might have been intentionally cleared of tools and debris before abandonment, hinting at an organized conclusion to their use rather than sudden desertion. Contradictions arise when comparing the cave's refined interiors with the surrounding region's known historical architecture. For aside from large earthen structures and tomb complexes, there are few parallels to excavations on this scale, leading to debates over whether the caves were part of a larger infrastructural network, perhaps connected by now collapsed passages or above-ground wooden complexes that left no trace, or whether they represent isolated undertakings whose motivations have not survived in written records. The uniformity of the chisel. Marks throughout most chambers has prompted analyses attempting to determine the direction and speed of the work, revealing patterns that suggest coordinated teams working in downward sequences. Yet, even this reconstruction leaves unanswered why such effort was invested in spaces that show no clear evidence of habitation, storage, or military use. And as such, the caves occupy a liminal space in archaeological interpretation, their scale demanding explanation, while their emptiness resists simple narratives. And while some propose they served as quarries whose stone was removed for large construction projects, the lack of corresponding monumental structures in nearby regions creates tension with this view, especially since the interior planning does not match typical quarry logic, where efficiency rather than symmetry governs extraction. Faced with these uncertainties, researchers often return to the caves themselves, studying subtle disruptions in wall patterns, patches of discoloration, and variations in ceiling thickness that hint at natural fissures or ancient collapses now stabilized by human intervention, suggesting a dynamic relationship between excavation and geological reality. Yet even this interplay does not fully illuminate why the caves were shaped with such care. And in the end, the Longyou caves persist as spaces where human intention and geological constraint meet in a dialogue rendered mute by the passage of time, for their vast halls offer no inscriptions, no narrative reliefs, and no clear spatial hierarchies, only the rhythmic texture of chisel marks and the quiet arrangement of pillars holding their weight in steady patience, leaving those who enter with the impression that the true story of the caves may lie not in hidden chambers or unexcavated recesses, but in the unresolved question of why such monumental effort was invested in a complex whose purpose remains suspended between practicality and abstraction, its meaning resting in the lingering silence that fills its stone geometry, inviting but never quite yielding to interpretation. Ellora Caves, Carved into the volcanic basalt cliffs of Maharashtra, the Ellora caves unfold along a winding escarpment, where religious devotion, shifting political climates, and the stubborn materiality of rock converge into a single architectural continuum that begins with modest excavations and gradually crescendos into vast complexes whose scale suggests not sudden inspiration, but a patient sequence of decisions unfolding over centuries. And as one moves from the early Buddhist viharas with their measured rows of cells and pillared halls into the later Hindu and Jain monuments, the stone seems to respond to evolving intentions, its surfaces transitioning from restrained austerity to elaborate sculptural programs that cover walls, ceilings, and freestanding columns in narratives wrought with such precision that they appear almost woven into the rock rather than carved from it, creating an environment where craftsmanship feels inseparable from geology. At first glance, the layout appears linear, yet subtle shifts in orientation, variations in depth, and inconsistencies in carving technique reveal a more complex story in which different traditions worked simultaneously or in overlapping phases, sometimes reconfiguring earlier designs, sometimes introducing unexpected architectural experiments, and this interleaving of religious expressions, Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain, embodies a cultural landscape more fluid than the clear divisions suggested by later textual traditions. A landscape where artisans and patrons navigated shared spaces with a mixture of collaboration, adaptation, and pragmatic coexistence, leaving inscriptions sparse and intentions only partially discernible from the stone. Among these excavations, the Kailasa temple stands as the most arresting anomaly. Its massive courtyard, columned galleries, and towering central shrine carved downward from a single block of rock, with such precision that the negative space itself becomes a kind of monumental sculpture, suggesting an engineering logic that required not only an understanding of load-bearing and drainage, but also an intuitive grasp of how to choreograph the removal of thousands of tons of basalt without compromising the final design. Yet despite its imposing clarity, contradictions emerge when examining the tool marks, unfinished surfaces, and uneven depths hidden in peripheral corridors, signs that the execution involved multiple teams working concurrently, adapting to unexpected fissures or collapses, and at times altering the plan in ways that remain undetectable to casual observation. The cave's reliefs, depicting episodes from mythic cycles, appear meticulously planned, yet close analysis reveals reworked figures, shifted compositions, and abandoned niches whose asymmetry hints at either evolving ritual requirements or the improvisations of artisans responding to the quirks of the stone. And this interplay between intention and constraint becomes even more apparent in the surrounding caves, where the contours of natural fractures guided the placement of pillars and the sequencing of chambers, creating subtle irregularities that complicate any assumption of strict architectural order. Geological studies show that the basalt flows here vary considerably in hardness, with softer horizons alternating with more resistant layers, a pattern that likely influenced both the location and the depth of certain excavations. And in places where the stone proved unexpectedly brittle, one sees evidence of reinforcement, pillars thicker than their counterparts, ceilings carved with relieving arches, or niches left unadorned, details that reflect an ongoing negotiation between artistic ambition and structural necessity. Yet for all this practical adaptation, the symbolic programs embedded within the caves introduce layers of meaning that resist definitive interpretation. For the juxtaposition of Buddhist Chaitya halls with Hindu shrines and Jain monasteries evokes a social dynamic in which multiple communities engaged in parallel acts of monumental expression, though the degree of interaction between them remains uncertain, and the absence of explicit historical records leaves room for hypotheses ranging from royal patronage that encourage pluralistic expression to more decentralized processes in which local guilds worked according to shifting patterns of support and competition. Some scholars argue that the caves reflect a period of deliberate religious harmony, while others propose that their coexistence may have been less about ideological unity and more about practical accommodation within a landscape already marked by earlier excavations. Yet archaeological evidence offers only partial answers, for while certain inscriptions link caves to specific rulers, many of the Grandest structures remain unclaimed, their creators known only through the traces of their tools and the patterns of their labor. Even the sequence of construction remains debated, with stylistic analyses suggesting overlapping periods rather than a neat chronological progression. And the presence of unfinished caves complicates the picture further, raising questions about whether work ceased due to political instability, exhausted patronage, or geological challenges that rendered some chambers unsuitable for completion. In the Jain caves at the northern end, the shift toward more delicate ornamentation and finely articulated pillars indicates yet another phase of adaptation. As artisans explored the limits of the basalt's capacity for intricate carving, pushing the material into forms that seem almost weightless compared to the massive monolith of Kailasa. And this contrast underscores the elasticity of Ellora's architectural imagination, which ranged from the monumental to the miniature within a single cliff face. Walking the length of the complex reveals layers of sound and silence shaped by its architecture. Echoes in the chaitya halls that amplify even the softest footfall, muted chambers where sound disappears into porous stone, and shaded courtyards where wind patterns hint at the open sky while remaining framed by rock, creating sensory ambiguities that suggest the caves were designed not only for visual experience, but for acoustic and atmospheric ones as well. And as the path traces the cliff's curvature, the cumulative impression is of a landscape shaped by centuries-long dialogue between human intention and basaltic mass, where each carving decision carried geological implications, and each geological constraint inspired new forms of expression, resulting in a complex whose unity lies not in a single purpose, but in the persistent human impulse to transform stone into a record of belief, memory, and craft. Yet, despite scholarly advances, much about Ellora remains uncertain, not in a dramatic sense of hidden chambers or lost civilizations, but in the quieter recognition that the motivations, sequences, and lived experiences behind its monumental forms are only partially recoverable, leaving the caves suspended between the clarity of their carved surfaces and the opacity of the histories they embody. Their long colonnades and shadowed halls offering a measured reminder that even in sites thoroughly mapped and studied, the deepest aspects of ancient architectural intent may continue to reside just beyond the reach of full understanding. Ajanta Caves, carved into a serpent-shaped bend of the Wakora River, the Ajanta Caves emerge from a basalt cliff in a long arc where shifting light, seasonal rains, and the ancient rhythms of monastic life once converged into a landscape that feels both sheltered and exposed, beginning with early excavation phases in which modest viharas, arranged around square halls with simple cells, suggest a community seeking contemplative refuge rather than grand expression. Their ceilings marked by unobtrusive toolwork and their facades displaying restrained ornamentation that hints at architectural tendencies still in formation. And as one moves along the curve of the cliff, the caves gradually shift in scope and ambition. The later Mahayana phases introducing elaborate chaitya halls with soaring vaulted ceilings, carved to resemble wooden prototypes, their ribbed surfaces catching angled shadows that soften the stone into quiet mimicry of organic form, while intricately sculpted facades adorned with guardians, musicians, and celestial figures unfold in rhythms that seem to echo the flow of the river below. Inside, the celebrated murals, still vibrant despite centuries of monsoon weathering and human presence, create atmospheres where narrative, ritual, and artistic experimentation intersect. The pigments layered in subtle gradations that preserve courtly scenes, didactic tales, and symbolic gestures rendered with such delicacy that they read almost like suspended motion. Though their preservation is uneven with flaked surfaces, soot-darkened patches, and repair attempts from different eras, all contributing to an interpretive puzzle that scholars continue to parse as they trace stylistic changes across the site. Contradictions emerge in the organization of the caves, for while the general sequence appears chronological, the coexistence of older Hinayana Chaityas alongside newer Mahayana Viharas reveals a landscape not of straightforward religious transition, but of overlapping practices, where older spaces were maintained or repurposed even as new architectural programs took shape, and such interactions complicate earlier narratives of abrupt doctrinal shifts, suggesting instead a more nuanced interplay in which artisans, donors, and monastic communities negotiated continuity and innovation within the confines of the cliff. Inscriptions attribute certain caves to specific patrons, royal figures, merchants, and local elites. Yet many of the grander spaces remain anonymous, their sponsorship obscured by time, and toolmark analyses indicate multiple guilds working simultaneously or sequentially, sometimes following coherent plans and sometimes adapting to unexpected geological conditions, such as variations in basalt, hardness, hidden fissures, or pockets of softer material that forced redesigns, abandoned niches, or reinforced pillars whose asymmetry becomes visible only upon close inspection. In Cave 19, the elaborately carved chaitya facade presents a level of detail that contrasts with the simpler interior surfaces, raising questions about whether its exterior served a specific ritual or social function, distinct from the meditative purposes of its hall, while in Cave 26, the monumental reclining Buddha and surrounding sculptural program suggest a complex negotiation between narrative storytelling and architectural framing, for the reliefs seem designed to guide movement and focus, yet include reworked figures and shifted compositions that imply ongoing adjustments during carving, either refinements of initial plans or responses to unexpected structural limitations. The murals themselves reveal layers of artistic decision-making as underdrawings occasionally emerge beneath flaked pigments, showing alterations in composition and changes in gesture or orientation that hint at a dynamic creative process rather than strict adherence to a singular blueprint. And their pigments, derived from local minerals, plant sources, and rare imports, attest to a network of materials extending beyond the immediate region, though the precise trade routes and workshop practices remain only partially understood. Environmental studies show that the cave's microclimate, once stabilized by the overhanging cliff, has shifted over centuries due to changes in vegetation, river flow, and even human visitation patterns, creating subtle alterations in humidity that affect mural preservation and offer clues about how ancient monks may have managed airflow and lighting using lamps, reflectors, and perhaps wooden screens now lost to decay, leaving behind only soot residues and faint discolorations on ceilings that suggest the rhythm of illumination during ritual or daily activity. The alignment of certain caves with seasonal light patterns has inspired hypotheses that the placement of entrances or windows responded to solstitial or equinoctial considerations, though such interpretations remain tentative, supported by circumstantial alignments rather than explicit evidence, and the cliff's natural curvature complicates these theories, for some orientations may result from geological constraints rather than deliberate solar alignment. Elsewhere, incomplete caves present further enigmas. Rough chambers with partially carved pillars, abandoned facade outlines, or sudden shifts in carving style that could reflect halted patronage, political upheavals, or geological instability. But in the absence of written explanations, they remain open to multiple readings, serving as silent records of intentions that never reached completion. And through all these layers, architectural, artistic, geological, the Ajanta complex demonstrates a long continuity of monastic presence. Yet its eventual decline and centuries-long burial beneath vegetation introduce a final mystery. For when rediscovered in the 19th century, the caves had been partly reclaimed by the cliff itself, their entrances obscured by soil and roots, as though time had attempted to fold them back into the landscape, and this partial concealment may have protected many of the murals while simultaneously erasing clues about their final centuries of use. Walking the sequence of caves today, one senses not only the technical mastery of their creators, but also the evolving intentions that guided their formation, from secluded monastic retreat to elaborately articulated devotional complex, each chamber bearing traces of adaptation to shifting beliefs, patronage networks, and geological realities, yet none offering a definitive account of how these forces intertwined. And as the path eventually returns to the forested slopes above the cliff, the lingering impression is that Ajanta's significance lies as much in its unresolved layers as in its celebrated artistry. For its murals and halls preserve a dialogue between aspiration and constraint, memory and erosion, leaving the sense that, even within a site meticulously studied and restored, the deeper motivations that shaped its long arc of creation remain suspended in the quiet recesses of its carved shadows, just beyond the reach of complete historical certainty. Derinkuyu. Beneath the quiet plains of Cappadocia, Derinkuyu descends through volcanic tuff in sequential layers that seem to blur the boundary between deliberate engineering and the slow geological rhythms that shaped the soft stone long before human hands began carving it. Starting with upper levels where broad chambers, storage rooms, and stable-like recesses suggest an early phase of habitation or refuge, their simple geometry and straightforward ventilation shafts hinting at practical concerns rather than grand design. Yet even here, small irregularities, unexpected alcoves, corridors that narrow without clear reason, and stairs that turn at slightly uneven angles imply a construction process responsive to the stone's shifting density, as though each expansion required moment-by-moment adaptation rather than adherence to a single predetermined plan. Deeper levels introduce tighter passageways and interconnected rooms arranged in patterns that seem at once cautious and intentional, for the vertical shafts that carry air throughout the complex operate with a consistency that belies the apparent disorder of the tunnels, suggesting that the builders, whether in isolated phases or across generations, possessed an empirical understanding of airflow that allowed them to maintain breathable conditions even as they carved downward through multiple stories, though the precise methods by which they tested and maintained ventilation remain speculative in the absence of written records. Rolling stone doors, circular monoliths positioned to seal off key junctions, appear at strategic points, their weight and placement hinting not at continuous occupation, but at episodic use during periods of threat. Yet their distribution is uneven, with some levels heavily fortified and others left open, raising questions about whether certain areas were designed for temporary refuge, long-term settlement, or specialized tasks whose purposes have been obscured by time. In some chambers, soot residues and small hearth depressions suggest domestic activity, while adjacent rooms show no such traces, creating a mosaic of uses that defies simple categorization as either a permanent underground city or an emergency shelter. And the absence of extensive organic deposits complicates efforts to determine how many people once occupied the space, or for how long, or whether its role shifted repeatedly across centuries of regional conflict, migration, or climatic instability. The deeper one goes, the more the architecture departs from purely functional logic, as narrow corridors suddenly widen into meeting rooms, or intersect with staircases that descend toward levels where water wells, communal areas, and storage cells form a network so extensive it feels less like a single project than the cumulative result of many small decisions made across time, with each generation adding or modifying rooms according to needs no longer fully recoverable, yet still legible in the shifting textures of tool marks that trace different eras of workmanship. Geological analyses reveal that the tuff varies substantially in hardness, the softer layers facilitating excavation, while the harder bands required adjustments to room placement and ceiling angles. And these constraints appear in unexpected offsets where chambers do not align vertically, or where staircases veer sideways to avoid resistant stone, producing spatial irregularities that, while practical, create an overall layout that feels labyrinthine, even though many passages ultimately reconnect with the main circulation routes. Contradictions emerge when comparing Derinkuyu to nearby underground complexes. For while some share similar features, ventilation shafts, storage areas, defensive doors, others exhibit organizational schemes that differ markedly, suggesting that the region's subterranean architecture grew not from a single cultural blueprint, but from a more fluid tradition of adapting the landscape for refuge, storage, or seasonal habitation, with individual communities developing their own patterns of excavation based on local needs and geological circumstances. Yet, Derinkuyu's depth, reaching roughly 18 stories, distinguishes it within this broader pattern and its lower levels, where the air grows stiller and the ceilings press nearer to the floor, contain spaces whose functions remain uncertain. Long corridors terminating in featureless dead ends, small annexes without ventilation, and chambers whose shapes resist comparison to known, domestic or industrial forms, prompting cautious hypotheses about storage, temporary confinement, or ritual activity, though none of these interpretations aligns neatly with the available evidence. Analyses of the ventilation system suggest that it may have been extended downward, in phases rather than planned from the outset, with early shafts later repurposed or expanded as new levels were carved, a process that would have required careful calibration to maintain airflow. Yet the builders left no inscriptions or markers to indicate how these adjustments were coordinated, leaving modern researchers to infer solutions from structural clues, such as the distribution of soot and the pattern of debris deposits near older shaft openings. Water management offers another puzzle, for the wells appear to be connected to aquifers that supplied both surface and underground communities. Yet the complex relationship between the underground channels and surface access points has not been fully reconstructed, raising questions about how water was controlled to prevent contamination or overuse during extended underground occupation, and whether the wells were original features or later additions to accommodate growing populations. The scale of Derinkuyu has inspired theories that range from simple refuge use to more elaborate interpretations involving long-term habitation during sieges or environmental crises. But archaeological evidence remains inconclusive, for while the infrastructure could support large numbers of people, the lack of extensive refuse layers or permanent fixtures suggests patterns of occupancy that were intermittent rather than continuous, perhaps aligning with cycles of conflict or seasonal movement rather than a single defining event. And as researchers map the tunnels with modern tools, they find blocked passages, collapsed sections, and partially filled corridors that hint at extensions now inaccessible, raising the possibility that the known complex is only part of a larger network once connected to neighboring underground settlements. Though the nature of these connections, formal, occasional, or simply geological coincidence, remains unresolved. Emerging from the lower levels, where silence seems to thicken with the weight of centuries, one senses that Derinkuyu's significance lies not only in its engineering achievements or its capacity for refuge, but in the layered history of adaptation etched into its walls, each chamber reflecting choices made under conditions we can only approximate. And as the final stairway returns to the open air, the contrast between the sunlit plain and the deep branching architecture below reinforces the impression that the complex represents an ongoing dialogue between human necessity and geological possibility, its purpose shaped by circumstances now blurred, leaving its full story suspended within the quiet geometry of its descending corridors, unresolved yet enduring in the depths beneath the earth. Catacombs of Paris. Beneath the orderly boulevards and quiet courtyards of Paris, the catacombs extend through a network of former limestone quarries whose origins long predate the city above. Beginning as a patchwork of medieval and early modern extraction sites carved to supply building stone for churches, bridges, and fortifications, their rough pillars and uneven ceilings shaped more by geological necessity than architectural intention, and only centuries later repurposed into the vast ossuary that now winds through dim corridors where the past accumulates in layers of bone and shadow. The transformation from quarry to repository unfolded gradually, prompted by collapsing ground, overcrowded cemeteries, and shifting urban priorities. And as engineers mapped the labyrinth beneath the city, they encountered incoherent passages, abandoned shafts, and flooded chambers that bore the imprint of earlier miners who carved according to the unpredictable contours of Lutetian limestone, leaving behind a fractured landscape that required consolidation before it could receive the remains of millions. Early stabilization efforts introduced masonry walls, reinforced pillars, and carved inscriptions marking dates and project leaders. Yet these interventions sit alongside untouched stretches of quarry where pick scars remain visible, their rhythmic patterns interrupted only by natural fissures or pockets of softer stone, creating a dialogue between purposeful engineering and the inherited geometry of extraction that persisted long after the miners left. When the ossuary was established in the late 18th century, bones were transferred from overfilled churchyards and arranged with measured formality. Skulls and femurs stacked in alternating courses, decorative patterns shaping macabre facades that mask the loose piles behind them. Yet even these carefully arranged displays contain inconsistencies, with some sections meticulously ordered and others more haphazard, reflecting variations in workforce, time constraints, and perhaps differing attitudes toward the remains themselves. And this juxtaposition contributes to the site's layered character, where order and disorder coexist in quiet equilibrium. In certain galleries, inscriptions offer morsels of reflection, quotations, dates, and moral reminders. Yet their placement is irregular, leaving stretches of corridor without commentary, as though the curator's intentions were themselves shaped by the unpredictable architecture of the quarries, which curve, narrow, and shift in elevation in ways that resist a fully unified design. Deeper within, older quarry features linger, carved signatures from 18th century inspectors, survey marks denoting structural concerns, and remnants of support systems once used to prevent collapses in unstable zones, while occasional damp chambers reveal natural seepage paths that have slowly reshaped the limestone, creating mineral deposits that blur the boundaries between human excavation and geological process. Contradictions appear when comparing maps from different periods, for the catacombs have been redrawn countless times as passages were closed, reinforced, or rerouted, and the shifting cartography reflects a subterranean landscape in perpetual negotiation with the city above, where construction, transportation, and groundwater management continually alter the stability of the terrain, prompting new interventions that sometimes obscure earlier configurations and leave researchers reconstructing lost connections from fragmentary records. Aside from the public ossuary, vast stretches of the network remain restricted, their tunnels maintaining the character of raw quarries marked by irregular pillars and sudden drops. And within these zones, unexpected features appear. Carved benches, makeshift chapels, and stone-cut basins whose purposes remain uncertain, perhaps created by quarry workers for rest or ritual, or by later visitors who repurposed abandoned chambers into informal gathering places, though the absence of contextual artifacts leaves these interpretations tentative. Geological studies reveal that the limestone layers here formed in ancient marine environments, their fossil-rich textures still visible in certain walls where excavation exposed bedding planes and subtle variations in sedimentation, and these geological features influence the quarry layout, with miners following the most workable strata, and leaving behind irregularities where harder layers force deviations in passage direction, creating a labyrinth shaped by both resource extraction and the stubborn complexity of the subterranean bedrock. The ossuary itself, though often viewed as a single entity, encompasses multiple phases of reorganization, with bones moved, restacked, or reclassified by successive custodians who impose their own sense of order on the remains, resulting in subtle differences in stacking technique and corridor composition that testify to changing priorities over time. Yet these differences are rarely visible without careful comparison, underscoring how much of the site's history lies in details that escape casual observation. And beneath these layers of engineering, geology, and human intervention lies the quiet enigma of why certain sections feel more finished than others, why some passages were chosen for ornamentation, while others were left raw, and whether the decisions reflected practical constraints, symbolic intentions, or the cumulative effects of centuries of maintenance responding to shifting needs. Walking through the long corridors where skulls stare outward from their ordered rows, one senses not a singular narrative, but an accumulation of incomplete stories shaped by urban growth, mortality, and the evolving relationship between the city and its underworld. Each chamber bearing traces of choices made under circumstances both documented and forgotten. And as the path eventually rises toward daylight, the transition from stone-lined darkness to the structured radiance of the modern city underscores the unresolved tension between the order imposed on the catacombs and the inherent irregularity of their geological origins, leaving the impression that the site's deepest mystery lies not in hidden chambers or undiscovered bones, but in the subtle interplay between human intention and the enduring complexity of the subterranean landscape that continues to shape and be shaped by the city above, Moaning Caverns. Hidden within the rolling foothills of the Sierra Nevada, Moaning Caverns descends through limestone, shaped by ancient marine sediments and slow geological dissolution. Its entrance a narrow shaft that opens into a vast vertical chamber whose proportions feel more like a natural cathedral than a typical cave. The walls rising in fluid contours that bear the signature of water's long retreat, their surfaces smoothed into pale whorls and faint ribs that track the downward flow of mineral-rich currents over tens of thousands of years, inviting the impression that the chamber was not so much formed as coaxed into being by persistent, unseen forces. The first descent reveals a quiet interplay of moisture and echo, for small droplets fall intermittently from high ledges to strike the stone below, generating the soft, resonant tones that gave the cavern its name. And though these sounds fluctuate with humidity, temperature shifts, and seasonal groundwater movement, the early discoverers often interpreted them as if the earth itself were breathing, an atmospheric effect that lingers in the cave's reputation even as geological explanations provide a more grounded understanding. Deeper within, the walls reveal subtle bands of color, oxidized iron, manganese staining, calcite veils, that trace environmental variations across millennia. And these layers, when viewed in sequence, form a partial archive of climatic shifts, whose wider implications reach far beyond the cavern, though the record is fragmentary and often blurred by subsequent mineral deposition, leaving researchers to piece together patterns through cautious sampling rather than continuous readings. Scattered across ledges and crevices, ancient bone deposits add a human dimension to the cave's story, yet even here clarity remains elusive, for some remains belong to individuals who fell or became trapped in pre-contact eras, while others are animal bones washed in during floods or dropped by predators utilizing the entrance as a natural trap, producing a mixture that complicates efforts to distinguish intentional human presence from accidental deposition. And this ambiguity is heightened by the absence of clear artifacts that might reveal deliberate use, habitation, or ritual activity. Early excavations in the 20th century unearthed one particularly well-preserved human skeleton, whose position suggested a fall down the vertical shaft. And while popular narratives transformed this discovery into tales of prehistoric tragedy or ceremonial descent, archaeological interpretations remain more cautious, noting the lack of contextual evidence that would support either theory conclusively, and the cave's vertical geometry makes accidental entry far more plausible than intentional exploration in ancient times. Yet certain aspects of the cavern's layout raise quieter questions, for the upper shaft gives way to branching passageways, whose contours vary from smooth and gently sloping to jagged and abrupt, reflecting the different rates at which water dissolved bedding plains and exploited fractures in the limestone. And in some recesses, the stone forms curious bulbous protrusions or hollowed alcoves that seem to evoke architectural niches, even though they result purely from the interplay of chemical erosion and capillary flow, offering shapes that invite interpretation, while resisting any clear narrative beyond natural process. The cavern's immense main chamber presents another puzzle. Its height and width suggest prolonged vertical dissolution, where water once cascaded in substantial volume. Yet the modern hydrology of the region shows no such major streams nearby, implying that the cave formed under environmental conditions quite different from those seen today. Conditions that may have included higher groundwater tables, more intense seasonal flooding, or prolonged periods of saturation that have since diminished, leaving the chamber as a remnant of an earlier landscape whose precise parameters remain uncertain. Speleothems, stalactites, flowstone draperies, and column-like formations appear sparsely compared to other limestone caves in the region, an uneven distribution that has led to hypotheses about airflow patterns, mineral availability, or temporal fluctuations in dripping water, yet none of these explanations fully accounts for why certain surfaces remain bare, while adjacent areas are coated in thick calcite deposits, and the patchiness suggests a microclimate once more variable than modern measurements reveal, perhaps influenced by now sealed openings or structural shifts caused by seismic events common to the Sierra foothills. In the lower chambers, tighter passages reveal cross-sections of ancient sediment fill that was later eroded out, leaving behind small terraces and scalloped walls whose markings align with the directional flow of subterranean water. And these traces allow geologists to reconstruct parts of the cave's developmental sequence, though the overall timeline remains only partially resolved due to the complex overlaps between dissolution, collapse, and mineral deposition, each layer of evidence overprinting the previous one in ways that obscure precise dating. Modern mapping technologies have identified minor offshoots that extend beyond the publicly accessible areas, and while none appear to rival the main chamber in scale, they hint at a broader network shaped by the same long processes, with some passages narrowing into fissures that suggest further dissolution potential or sealed cavities beyond reach, though current surveys conclude that most significant voids have already been exposed. Still, the cave's acoustics continue to provoke fascination, for the moaning sounds fluctuate in ways not fully captured by simple airflow models, sometimes intensifying in dry months when one might expect reduced resonance, at other times fading even when dripping increases, pointing toward a subtle combination of air pressure changes, temperature inversions within the shaft, and the shifting resonance of water films on distant walls, producing a phenomenon that, while scientifically explicable, retains an elusive quality in practice. And as visitors descend spiral stairways or rappel into the main chamber, the sense of entering a place shaped almost entirely by natural forces contrasts with scattered signs of human intervention, metal steps, anchored platforms, and archaeological markers. Yet these modifications do little to diminish the impression that the cave's vastness is inseparable from deeper geological rhythms that both reveal and conceal the past, offering glimpses of ancient human encounters without confirming a larger narrative. Rising back toward the surface, where daylight replaces the muted glow of lamps and the cave's quiet resonance gradually dissipates, one carries an impression shaped less by singular discoveries than by the cumulative interplay of stone, water, and time, a sense that Moaning Caverns holds neither dramatic secrets nor fully decipherable histories, but instead preserves the subtler mystery of a landscape formed under conditions now partially lost. Its vertical chamber, a lingering reminder of forces that once shaped the region with slow, unrecorded persistence, leaving behind a space where natural acoustics and geological memory intersect in ways that remain just beyond complete explanation. Cappadocia's underground labyrinths. Spread across the soft volcanic tuff of central Anatolia, Cappadocia's underground labyrinths extend beneath a landscape already marked by surreal pinnacles, eroded valleys, and rock-cut dwellings, forming a hidden counterpart to the region's surface architecture, where communities carve deeply into the earth, not as a single unified project, but as a long, incremental response to shifting needs, geological opportunities, and historical pressures, beginning with modest storage rooms and shallow refuges that later expanded into multi-level complexes whose passages weave through the subsurface with an organic irregularity, shaped by both human intent and the unpredictable textures of the stone. Unlike the more concentrated depth of Derinkuyu, the labyrinths of Cappadocia spread laterally as much as they descend, their networks branching outward to create clusters of chambers linked by narrow stairways, slotted doorways, and angled corridors that adapt to the layered tuff, which varies noticeably in hardness and moisture retention, prompting excavators to shift direction when encountering resistant bands or unstable pockets that required reinforcement or abandonment, a process evident in truncated passages, half-formed rooms, and abrupt changes in ceiling height that preserve the record of decisions made in response to the stone itself. Above ground, the region's cave churches, pigeon lofts, and carved dwellings hint at a long tradition of working with the tuff, but the subterranean spaces exhibit a distinct logic, with ventilation shafts, concealed entrances, and rolling stone doors that suggest episodic use during times of conflict, though the distribution of these defensive features varies from site to site, supporting the idea that each community developed its own strategies rather than conforming to a regional template. And this autonomy complicates efforts to classify the labyrinths according to fixed categories such as permanent settlements, monastic retreats, or emergency shelters. In many complexes, simple domestic features, fire-blackened niches, grain bins, wine presses, appear alongside storage silos large enough to support extended habitation. Yet the absence of robust refuse layers implies that occupancy may have been intermittent, with groups retreating underground temporarily during periods of unrest or climatic extremes, leaving only minimal material traces of their presence. Certain corridors connect multiple complexes or appear to converge towards central communication routes, though whether these connections reflect planned coordination between communities or the gradual merging of excavations over generations remains uncertain, as geological voids, collapsed tunnels, and erosional losses have obscured the original extent of the networks. The presence of chapels carved into some subterranean spaces introduces another layer of interpretation for their simple altars. Crosses incised into walls and occasional apses suggest ritual activity. Yet the modesty of these features contrasts with the richly decorated rock-cut churches above ground, implying either different functions or limited time for embellishment. And the ambiguous relationship between the two architectural traditions has led scholars to debate whether the underground chapels served mainly as temporary refugees for monastic communities or as communal sacred spaces used during specific periods of displacement. Geological analyses reveal that many of the labyrinths exploit natural weaknesses, vertical fractures, bedding planes, and zones of softer material, using these lines of least resistance to guide excavation, a strategy that produced meandering passageways whose shapes seem labyrinthine, not by intentional design, but by the necessity of following the stone's internal structure. And this merging of natural and human geometries complicates modern mapping efforts, as some early surveyors mistook natural voids for unfinished chambers and human-cut expansions for natural fissures. Contradictions arise when comparing historical accounts with archaeological evidence. For medieval chroniclers describe large populations taking refuge underground, yet the absence of extensive domestic debris suggests that these events, if they occurred, were short-lived or involved only certain areas of the complexes. And while oral traditions speak of tunnels stretching for miles between towns, modern surveys often encounter collapsed sections or geological barriers that limit the continuity of these routes, leaving open the question of whether the networks were ever as integrated as later narratives suggest. Water management adds another layer of complexity, as some labyrinths include wells that tap into local aquifers, while others lack such features entirely, implying variable durations of intended use or reliance on stored supplies. Yet the relationship between these subterranean wells and surface water systems is imperfectly understood due to sediment infill and modern alterations that obscure their original depth and function. Certain lower rooms exhibit smooth, rounded walls consistent with long-term air and moisture circulation, rather than intensive human activity, suggesting that natural processes may have modified or even enlarged some chambers after their initial excavation, blurring the distinction between original form and later transformation. And in a few cases, mineral crusts partially obscure tool marks, complicating efforts to determine the exact sequence of carving and subsequent environmental change. Mapping the labyrinths with modern technology reveals a patchwork of interconnected and isolated spaces, some extending beneath present-day villages, while others lie abandoned in remote valleys. And this variability reflects the long temporal span of their creation, from early periods when basic shelters sufficed to later eras when communities expanded and adapted existing networks in response to political change, invasions, or shifts in settlement patterns. Yet, despite growing precision in understanding their construction techniques, the motivations behind the labyrinths remain only partially recoverable, for they represent neither a single architectural tradition nor a uniform social response, but rather a flexible adaptation to a landscape where soft stone offered both opportunity and vulnerability, enabling expansion while demanding constant negotiation with geological constraints. And as one emerges from these shadowed corridors into the bright, sculpted terrain above, where fairy chimneys and cliff dwellings echo the subterranean forms in inverted relief, the impression endures that Cappadocia's underground labyrinths are best understood not as hidden cities or monolithic refuges, but as cumulative expressions of survival, community, and environmental adaptation, their mysteries lying less in secret chambers or uncharted depths than in the subtle interplay between human agency and a landscape that both facilitated and constrained every decision carved into its yielding stone, leaving the full story of these vast networks suspended somewhere between historical memory and the quiet persistence of the volcanic earth that shelters them.
5,000 years ago, on the edge of the Atlantic, someone planned villages with stone furniture, carved perfect circles into bedrock, aligned tombs to a single winter sunset, and raised towers that watched the sea, yet left no written language, no kings, no names. How did isolated islands coordinate monuments across miles of land and water? Why do homes, temples, and tombs follow the same hidden order? And if these were simple farming societies, why does their engineering still outperform time itself? Were these sites independent experiments, or fragments of a single forgotten civilization whose logic we no longer understand? Skara Brae, Neolithic village. Set low against the wind-scoured coast of Orkney's mainland, where the Atlantic presses endlessly against stone and turf. Skara Brae does not announce itself so much as it slowly emerges, as if the land itself were remembering something it once chose to forget. Its clustered dwellings, revealed only after a 19th century storm, stripped away the protective blanket of sand and soil that had hidden them for millennia, exposing a Neolithic village preserved with an intimacy that feels almost intrusive, as though daily life had been paused rather than abandoned. Built around 3180 BCE and occupied for roughly 6 centuries, Skara Brae belongs to a period when farming communities across northern Europe were still experimenting with permanence. Yet here the evidence suggests a level of architectural planning, domestic comfort, and social coherence that feels unusually assured for such an early time. Each house is sunk into the earth, its walls constructed from carefully stacked flagstone, insulated by surrounding midden deposits that served both as waste and thermal protection, creating interiors that were remarkably stable in temperature despite the harsh climate outside. Narrow covered passageways link the dwellings, allowing movement between homes without direct exposure to the elements, a subtle but telling indication that communal living and environmental adaptation were deeply intertwined. Inside, the stone furniture remains fixed in place. Beds flanking the walls, central hearths for heat and light, shelving units and storage boxes set opposite the entrance, as if arranged according to shared conventions, suggesting that these were not improvised shelters, but standardized domestic spaces shaped by long-standing tradition. The repetition of layout across the settlement implies a strong cultural template, one in which personal expression yielded to collective norms, raising questions about how identity, hierarchy, and privacy were understood in a society that invested so much effort in uniformity. Artifacts recovered from the site, grooved ware pottery, stone tools, bone pins, and gaming pieces, point to a community engaged not only in subsistence, but in craft, leisure, and symbolic behavior, their daily routines anchored by both practicality and ritualized habit. The absence of clear defensive features, combined with the inward-facing design of the village, hints at a social environment where cooperation outweighed conflict, or where threats were perceived as distant enough not to require fortification, an assumption that may have been enabled by Orkney's island geography and relative isolation. Yet Skara Brae was not isolated in a cultural sense. It existed within a dense ceremonial landscape that included monumental structures such as Maeshowe, the standing stones of Stennis, and the Ring of Brodgar, all within a few kilometers, suggesting that domestic life and ceremonial activity were components of a single integrated worldview rather than separate spheres. The village's orientation, the placement of entrances, and the subtle alignment of structures with the surrounding landscape raise the possibility that even these modest homes were informed by cosmological considerations, though direct evidence remains elusive and interpretations cautious. What is striking is how durable the settlement proved to be, enduring generations of occupation in a coastal zone that today feels precarious. A reminder that sea levels, shorelines, and climate conditions have shifted significantly since the Neolithic, altering not only the physical environment, but the assumptions we project onto it. The eventual abandonment of Skara Brae appears to have been gradual rather than catastrophic, with no clear signs of violence or sudden disaster, leaving open the possibility that environmental change, resource pressure, or social transformation slowly rendered the site untenable or obsolete. Some houses show signs of modification and repair over time, while others seem to have been deliberately infilled, suggesting choices made rather than forced exits, decisions that speak to adaptability rather than collapse. Still, questions persist about the social structure that sustained such a settlement for centuries. Whether leadership existed in formal roles or was distributed through kinship networks, how labor was organized for construction and maintenance, and how knowledge, architectural, agricultural, ceremonial, was transmitted across generations without written language. The remarkable preservation of Skara Brae can create the illusion of completeness, yet what survives is only the stone framework of a lived reality, once filled with perishable materials, sounds, smells, and rhythms that are now irretrievable, reminding us that even the best preserved prehistoric sites are partial narratives, shaped as much by what endures as by what vanishes. As coastal erosion continues to threaten the site today, with modern engineering struggling to hold back forces that once seemed manageable to its original inhabitants, Skara Brae occupies an uneasy position between revelation and loss, offering an unprecedented window into Neolithic domestic life, while underscoring how fragile that window remains. It stands not as an anomaly, but as a point of reference, challenging assumptions about technological simplicity and social development in early farming societies, and suggesting that beneath the monumental stones and ceremonial alignments of ancient Scotland lay a sophisticated everyday world, carefully built, quietly ordered, and deeply attuned to both land and community. A world whose full complexity can be approached, but never entirely recovered, lingering instead in stone walls worn smooth by hands that shaped them, and in rooms that still seem to wait patiently for lives that moved on long ago. Ring of Brodgar, rising from a narrow isthmus between the locks of Hare and Stennis, where fresh water and salt water nearly meet, but remain distinct. The Ring of Brodgar occupies a landscape that feels deliberately chosen, its vast stone circle set within a natural amphitheatre of low hills and open sky, creating a sense of enclosure without walls and monumentality without elevation, as if scale itself were the primary material. Begun around 2500 BCE and expanded over time, the ring once held as many as 60 standing stones, though fewer than half now remain, each slender monolith shaped from local sandstone and positioned with a precision that suggests careful surveying rather than approximation. Encircling the stones is a deep, rock-cut ditch, more than 3 meters deep in places, an immense undertaking for a society without metal tools, yet notably lacking any accompanying bank, an absence that complicates defensive interpretations and reinforces the impression that the boundary was symbolic rather than martial. The sheer size of the enclosure, over 100 meters in diameter, places it among the largest stone circles in Britain. But unlike later monumental forms, its power derives not from mass, but from repetition and rhythm, from the way individual stones relate to one another and to the surrounding horizon. There is no clear entrance, no obvious focal point, and no central feature to anchor interpretation, encouraging movement around rather than toward the monument, and suggesting that participation, procession, or cyclical observation may have been integral to its use. Excavations have revealed little in the way of domestic debris, reinforcing the sense that this was not a place of dwelling, but of gathering, its purpose anchored in activities that left minimal physical trace. The proximity of the Ring of Brodgar to other major Neolithic and early Bronze Age monuments has long prompted interpretations that see it as part of a coordinated ceremonial complex, yet its distinct form and scale indicate that it was not merely a repetition of nearby traditions, but an evolution of them, perhaps reflecting changing social needs or cosmological emphases. The stones themselves vary subtly in height, shape, and spacing, creating sightlines that shift as one moves through the circle, opening and closing views toward distant hills and other monuments, an effect that may have been intentional, though the absence of clear alignments tied to solstices or equinoxes cautions against overly deterministic readings. Instead, the Ring of Brodgar seems designed to frame experience rather than dictate meaning, offering a setting in which collective presence, memory, and seasonal rhythms could be enacted rather than observed. The labour required to quarry, transport, and erect the stones implies a level of organisation extending beyond any single household or village, suggesting cooperation across communities, perhaps drawing participants from settlements like Skara, Brae, and beyond, binding them together through shared effort as much as shared belief. Yet, despite this scale, the monument carries an austere restraint, lacking carvings, inscriptions, or overt iconography, relying instead on geometry and landscape to communicate significance. Over time, stones were removed, toppled, or repurposed, particularly in later historical periods, when Christian authorities sought to neutralize what they perceived as pagan sites, an act that paradoxically affirms the monument's enduring symbolic weight long after its original meanings had faded. What remains today is a partial circle that still commands attention through emptiness as much as presence, its missing stones as suggestive as those that stand, inviting speculation about continuity and rupture in the cultural memory of Orkney. The Ring of Brodgar resists simple explanation because it occupies a space between function and abstraction, between architecture and environment, offering no clear narrative, but instead a structured silence, one that hints at gatherings shaped by movement, sound, and shared awareness rather than fixed ritual scripts. In this way, it complements the domestic clarity of sites like Skara Brae by revealing another dimension of Neolithic life, one less concerned with shelter and sustenance, and more with cohesion, identity, and the marking of time through collective presence in a place set apart. A place whose meaning may have shifted subtly with each generation, yet whose form endured long enough to outlast them all, standing as a reminder that some of the most ambitious constructions of the ancient world were not built to enclose, dominate, or commemorate individuals, but to create spaces where communities could briefly step outside ordinary life and inhabit a shared horizon. Of meaning that remains, even now, only partially visible. Callanish stones. On the Isle of Lewis, far from the concentrated ceremonial core of Orkney, yet bound to it by shared architectural language and Atlantic horizons, the Callanish stones rise from a gently sloping moor where peat, water, and sky merge into a muted palette that shifts constantly with light and weather, giving the monument an almost fluid presence despite the weight of its stone. Erected around 3000 BCE and modified over centuries, the site centers on a tall monolith surrounded by a near-perfect stone circle, from which avenues of stones extend outward in a cruciform pattern, creating a form that is at once ordered and open-ended, its geometry suggesting intention without revealing motive. The stones themselves are irregular, rough-hewn slabs of local gneiss, their jagged profiles resisting symmetry and polish, as if the builders accepted and perhaps valued the natural character of the material rather than attempting to impose uniformity. Beneath the circle lies a small burial chamber, discovered through excavation, indicating that the site once incorporated mortuary elements, though whether these were central to its function or later additions remains uncertain. The presence of burial activity introduces an intimate dimension to a monument otherwise defined by openness and scale, linking the living landscape of stone and sky to the unseen realm below. Surrounding the stones, the peat-covered ground preserves traces of an earlier surface that would have been dry grassland at the time of construction, reminding us that the present-day sense of isolation and saturation is a product of later environmental change, not necessarily the setting experienced by its builders. The central monolith, towering above the circle, appears to anchor the composition, yet it does not dominate it. Instead, the extending stone rows draw attention outward toward the wider landscape, toward distant hills and celestial paths that shift with the seasons. Astronomical interpretations have long focused on lunar cycles, particularly the complex movements of the moon at major standstill points, which are especially pronounced at this northern latitude. And while some alignments appear suggestive, the evidence remains circumstantial, complicated by later stone movement and incomplete preservation. What seems more certain is that Callanish was designed to engage with cyclical change, whether celestial, seasonal or social, its form encouraging repeated visitation and reinterpretation rather than a single fixed event. Over time, parts of the monument appear to have been deliberately buried by peat, or perhaps intentionally decommissioned, a process that implies not abandonment, but transformation, as if the site's role evolved alongside the community's beliefs. Medieval folklore later framed the stones as petrified giants or fallen invaders, narratives that, while mythological, testify to the monument's enduring presence in local consciousness and to the human tendency to animate what resists explanation. Unlike the ring of Brodgar's expansive emptiness, Callanish feels densely articulated, its stones closer together, its pathways more directive, creating a sense of procession and convergence that contrasts with its open moorland setting. The labour required to erect the monument in such a remote location suggests that it served a significance extending beyond local identity, perhaps functioning as a regional gathering place or a focal point in a network of sites distributed across the Hebrides. Yet, despite its scale and complexity, Callanish offers no inscriptions, no explicit markers of authority or ownership, leaving its meanings deliberately unclaimed and therefore adaptable. In this way, it occupies a middle ground between the domestic stability seen at settlements like Skara, Brae, and the expansive communal abstraction of Orkney's great circles, blending elements of burial, movement, and landscape engagement into a form that resists reduction to any single purpose. The Callanish stones endure not because their original function is clearly legible, but because their design accommodates uncertainty, allowing each generation to encounter them anew, to project significance onto a framework that remains structurally constant while interpretively open, a quality that may explain why, even after thousands of years of environmental change and cultural turnover, the stones still feel less like relics of a finished past and more like participants in an ongoing dialogue between land, sky, and human attention. Standing stones of Stennis. Positioned on a low promontory between the shallow waters of the lochs of Stennis and Harray, the standing stones of Stennis occupy a landscape defined by thresholds, where land narrows, horizons widen, and the separation between elements becomes as meaningful as their convergence, a setting that mirrors the monument's own emphasis on boundary and balance. Raised around 3100 BCE, The site is among the earliest known stone circles in Britain, predating even the ring of Brodgar nearby, and its form is strikingly austere. A small number of tall, thin stones arranged within a circular enclosure, once surrounded by a substantial ditch and bank that created a clear demarcation between interior and exterior space. Unlike later circles that emphasize abundance or repetition, Stennis relies on restraint, its limited number of stones, creating a sparse geometry that draws attention to alignment, spacing, and sightline rather than mass. At the centre once stood a large, hearth-like feature, discovered through excavation, containing animal bones and traces of burning, suggesting that communal feasting or ritualized consumption played a role in the site's use, anchoring abstract spatial design in physical acts that engaged the senses. Nearby, the so-called altar stone, a massive slab that differs markedly from the upright monoliths, introduces an element of contrast and has long invited speculation, though its precise role remains unclear and may have shifted over time. The monument's proximity to Mysore and the Ring of Brodgar places it within a tightly knit ceremonial landscape, yet its earlier date suggests that it may have set a precedent, establishing spatial conventions and symbolic priorities that later builders expanded upon rather than replicated. Excavations indicate that the stones once stood within a carefully prepared setting, the ditch cut deep into bedrock, an effort that underscores the importance of separation and intentional access, even though no defensive function is evident. Movement into the circle would have been deliberate, possibly constrained to specific points, reinforcing the sense that entry itself carried meaning. Over time, the monument appears to have been altered and partially dismantled, with stones removed or toppled, actions that may reflect changing ritual practices rather than simple neglect. Historical records describe deliberate destruction in the 18th century, when a local landowner attempted to demolish the stones, an episode that reveals how powerfully the site continued to provoke reaction long after its original context had vanished. The visual relationship between Stennis and the surrounding monuments is difficult to ignore. From within the circle, sightlines extend toward Maesho's low mound and the distant arc of Brodgar, creating a network of visual references that suggest coordination across the landscape, even if the exact nature of that coordination remains elusive. The thinness and height of the stones accentuate their fragility, emphasizing verticality against the broad horizontal sweep of water and sky, an aesthetic choice that feels deliberate and symbolically charged. Stennis does not overwhelm through scale, but through precision, its limited elements arranged to focus attention and heighten awareness of place. In this sense, it functions as a pivot point between domestic and monumental expressions of Neolithic life, closer to the everyday world of nearby settlements, yet unmistakably set apart, a place where routine activities gave way to formalized gatherings that reinforced shared values and collective memory. The standing stones of Stennis endure as a study in how minimal means can produce profound spatial effect, reminding us that early monument builders were not merely experimenting with stone, but with perception itself, shaping how people moved, gathered, and understood their position within a carefully ordered landscape that extended beyond the visible stones into a broader system of meaning that remains only partially intact. Clava Cairns. Near the eastern edge of the Great Glen, where the River Narn curves gently through a wooded terrace before opening toward the Moray Firth, the Clava Cairns occupy a setting that feels quietly deliberate, removed from dramatic elevation, yet precisely tuned to light, horizon, and seasonal rhythm. Constructed around 2500 BCE, at the transition between the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, the site consists of a group of well-built cairns surrounded by standing stones, their circular forms and carefully defined entrances suggesting a fusion of architectural clarity and symbolic restraint. Two of the cairns are passage graves, each with a narrow, stone-lined corridor leading into a central chamber, while a third is a ring cairn lacking an internal space, a variation that hints at evolving ritual practices within a shared tradition. The passages are aligned with the setting sun at the winter solstice, an alignment confirmed through repeated observation, where light briefly penetrates the chambers before fading, a fleeting moment that would have required both patience and precision to establish. Unlike the dramatic illumination associated with Mythical, the effect at Clava is subdued, the light restrained by thick stone and limited angles, reinforcing a sense of quiet transition rather than spectacle. The cairns are constructed from carefully selected stones, graded by size and colour, with darker stones placed near the base and lighter ones above, creating subtle visual patterning that becomes apparent only through close attention. Encircling each cairn is a ring of standing stones, varying in height and arranged so that the tallest stones align with the entrance, reinforcing directional emphasis and guiding movement and sight toward the passage. Excavations have revealed cremated human remains, pottery and stone tools, confirming funerary use. Yet the limited quantity of remains suggests that these were not communal cemeteries in the modern sense, but selective monuments, perhaps reserved for individuals or lineages whose significance extended beyond death. The surrounding landscape, now wooded, would originally have been more open, allowing clear views toward distant hills and the low winter sun, situating the cairns within a broader environmental frame that reinforced their seasonal function. The careful construction and enduring stability of the monuments suggest a community capable of long-term planning and intergenerational knowledge transmission, particularly in understanding solar movement and its symbolic potential. Yet Clava Cairns do not exist in isolation. Similar monuments are found across northeast Scotland, forming a regional tradition that contrasts with the monumental stone circles of Orkney, while sharing an underlying concern with alignment, enclosure, and transformation. The emphasis on the winter solstice points to a preoccupation with cycles of death and renewal, a theme that resonates with the funerary context without resolving its deeper meanings. Over time, the site's original significance faded, yet its physical integrity preserved a sense of intentionality that later generations recognized even without understanding its origins. Folklore and antiquarian interest layered new interpretations onto the cairns, but the stones themselves resisted redefinition, maintaining a quiet authority rooted in form rather than narrative. Clava Cairns offer a glimpse into a moment when monument building shifted inward, from expansive communal gathering spaces toward more intimate engagements with mortality and time, suggesting a cultural adjustment rather than a rupture. The site's enduring power lies not in mystery alone, but in coherence, in the way architecture, landscape, and celestial rhythm converge to create an experience that remains legible even after its symbolic language has dimmed, standing as a measured reflection on continuity and change within a prehistoric society that expressed its deepest concerns through stone, light, and carefully bounded space. Dun Carloway Broch. On the west coast of the Isle of Lewis, overlooking a narrow inlet where sea and land negotiate their boundaries through tide and weather, Dun Carloway rises with a solidity that feels both familiar and out of sequence. A massive dry stone tower whose presence marks a clear departure from the open ceremonial forms that dominate earlier prehistoric Scotland. Built sometime between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, the Broch belongs to the Iron Age, a period defined less by monumental ritual than by enclosure, visibility and control. Yet, its precision and ambition suggest continuity as much as change. The circular tower, originally standing perhaps over 10 meters high, is constructed with double-skinned walls that enclose a hollow interior, a sophisticated engineering solution that allowed for height, stability, and internal stairways without mortar, relying instead on careful stone selection and placement. Unlike the stone circles and cairns that engage the horizon and the sky, Dun Carloway turns inward, its thick walls narrowing the outside world into framed views through a single entrance and small openings, emphasizing protection, separation, and oversight. The entrance passage is long and low, deliberately constraining movement, and once incorporated door checks and bar holes, clear indicators of defensive intent, or at least of controlled access. Inside, the central court would have been roofless, surrounded by galleries and ledges within the walls, spaces that suggest storage, habitation, or lookout points, though their exact functions remain debated. The Broch's position commands views across land and sea routes, implying a role in monitoring movement, whether for trade, communication, or defense. Yet there is little evidence for sustained siege or warfare, complicating interpretations that cast Brochs purely as fortifications. Instead, Dun Carloway may represent a statement of authority and permanence, its scale and labour investment signalling status within a competitive social landscape where visibility mattered as much as security. Unlike earlier monuments that appear to have been built by broadly cooperative communities, Brochs imply concentrated control over labour and resources, raising questions about social stratification and leadership in Iron Age societies. Yet even here, the construction technique reflects deep continuity with earlier stone traditions, the same sensitivity to balance, weight, and interlocking forms seen in Neolithic architecture, now repurposed toward different social goals. Excavation evidence suggests that Dun Carloway was occupied over a relatively short period before partial collapse and abandonment, its upper levels falling inward while lower walls remained intact, a process that froze the structure in a moment between use and ruin. Later communities reused the site intermittently, adapting it without fully restoring it, an acknowledgement of its enduring utility and symbolic presence even as its original role faded. Standing amid the open Atlantic landscape, the Broch feels less ceremonial than assertive, its vertical mass contrasting sharply with the horizontal spread of earlier sacred sites. Yet it does not erase them. Instead, it overlays a new architectural language onto an old terrain, one already dense with memory. Dun Carloway thus occupies a transitional position in Scotland's long stone-built narrative, reflecting a society that still trusted stone as its primary medium, but now sought privacy, defensibility, and permanence rather than openness and alignment. The tower does not explain itself, offering no inscriptions or clear historical anchors, but its form speaks of a world increasingly concerned with boundaries between inside and outside, power and community, safety and exposure, suggesting that the landscapes once shaped to gather people together were now being reinterpreted to hold them apart. In this shift, Dun Carloway stands not as a break from the past, but as a reframing of it, an acknowledgement that the same land which once hosted open circles and shared horizons could also support towers of stone rising quietly, watching and waiting, their meanings layered atop centuries of earlier human intention that never fully disappeared. Maeshowe Passage Tomb. Set within the heart of Orkney's ceremonial landscape, where low rolling land draws the eye gently toward horizon rather than sky, Maeshowe rises as a grassy mound that conceals its complexity until one moves closer, its outward simplicity masking an interior shaped by precision, patience, and an exacting relationship with light and time. Constructed around 2800 BCE, Maeshowe is among the finest examples of a Neolithic passage tomb in northwestern Europe. Its massive stone-built chamber, hidden beneath tons of earth and carefully fitted masonry, forming a structure that has endured with remarkable integrity for over 5,000 years. A long, low passage leads inward, its walls lined with enormous slabs set so tightly that even today the interior remains dry, a testament to the builder's understanding of weight distribution and water management. The passage is aligned with the setting sun at the winter solstice, and on those few days each year, sunlight penetrates deep into the chamber, briefly illuminating the back wall before retreating, an event that transforms the enclosed darkness into a measured, fleeting moment of connection between interior and exterior worlds. Unlike later monumental spectacles, the effect is quiet and controlled, requiring precise timing and shared awareness rather than mass participation, reinforcing the sense that my show was designed for select gatherings rather than large assemblies. The central chamber is corbelled upward with extraordinary skill, each stone course projecting inward until the ceiling closes at a height that feels both imposing and intimate, its geometry carefully balanced to support the immense weight above. 3 side cells open from the chamber, their symmetry reinforcing a sense of order and containment, though their exact purpose remains uncertain, as human remains are sparse and fragmented, suggesting that my show was not primarily a tomb in the conventional sense, but a monument where burial, ritual, and cosmological symbolism intersected. The scale of labour required to quarry, transport, and position the stones implies coordinated effort across communities, drawing on shared knowledge and collective investment that extended beyond any single generation. My show's location is no accident. It sits within direct visual and spatial relationship to the standing stones of Stennis and the Ring of Brodgar, forming a triangle of monuments that appears deliberately arranged, binding movement, sightlines, and seasonal cycles into a unified ceremonial landscape. From the mound, the surrounding terrain unfolds in measured gradients, reinforcing the sense that the builders understood not only architecture, but how it would be encountered through approach, pause, and entry. Over centuries, my show remained intact, its sealed interior preserving silence until it was forcibly entered in the 12th century by Norse visitors who left behind one of the largest collections of runic inscriptions outside Scandinavia. These carvings, etched casually into ancient stone, speak of treasure hunts, winter shelter, and personal boasts, their presence both intrusive and revealing, demonstrating how monuments outlive their meanings and become canvases for new narratives layered atop old structures. Yet even this later reuse underscores Meishow's continued gravitational pull, its form commanding attention long after its original builders were forgotten. Unlike stone circles that emphasize openness and movement, Meishow directs experience inward, guiding the body along a single axis toward a defined point, a spatial discipline that mirrors its temporal focus on a specific moment in the solar year. The monument appears to encode time, not as an abstract cycle, but as an embodied event, something entered, waited for, and briefly witnessed before darkness returns. This emphasis on containment and timing suggests a worldview deeply concerned with thresholds between light and dark, life and death, seasons passing and returning. While definitive interpretations remain elusive, my show's precision argues against randomness or purely symbolic gesture. It reflects accumulated observation and a desire to fix certain relationships between land, sky, and human presence in stone. As part of Orkney's broader Neolithic complex, it balances the openness of nearby circles with an inward gravity, offering a counterpoint that completes rather than contradicts the surrounding monuments. Where Skara Brae reveals the rhythms of daily life and Brodgar frames communal gathering, my show confronts duration itself, anchoring human experience within cycles that extend beyond individual lifespans. Its survival into the present, still capable of performing its solstice alignment, collapses time in a way few. structures can, allowing a modern observer to stand within a chamber shaped by hands that anticipated the same winter sun thousands of years ago. In this continuity lies Meishoe's quiet power, not as a riddle to be solved, but as a demonstration of how deeply prehistoric societies understood permanence, how they invested meaning not in grand display, but in exact alignment, restraint, and patience, leaving behind a monument that does not explain its purpose, yet continues to perform it silently each year as the light returns and withdraws, just as it always has. What if the timelines we trust are only the most recent skin on structures far older than our history books dare to suggest? Across Italy, from the Pantheon's impossible symmetry to the sunken roads of the Etruscans and the basalt towers of Sardinia, there are places where architecture seems to appear already perfected, as though inheriting knowledge from builders we can no longer name. Foundations misaligned with later walls, tunnels carved with forgotten purposes, mega structures rising from layers that whisper of deeper origins. Each site holds quiet contradictions that resist easy explanation. And as we trace these ruins across the peninsula, a single question grows harder to ignore. Are we standing on the final chapters of a story whose beginning has long since slipped from sight? Pantheon. In the heart of modern Rome, the Pantheon rests with a composure that seems almost indifferent to the ages pressing against its weathered stones, its rotunda rising like a quiet challenge to the very idea that time measures all things. And as the morning light spills across the Piazza della Rotonda, it reveals a structure whose harmony of proportions has long suggested an origin more elusive than its imperial inscriptions imply. For while Hadrian's reconstruction in the 2nd century CE stands as the conventional boundary of its history, the deeper foundations hint at earlier phases whose purposes are only partly understood, embedded in brickwork and substructures that do not always align with later symmetry, as though fragments of an older architectural intention were absorbed into the grander form we know today. And within this circular shell, where the coffered dome rises unbroken toward the oculus, the geometry appears so deliberate and mathematically confident that it often prompts questions about how Roman engineers perfected techniques, particularly in concrete grading and aggregate distribution, that seem to have reached a maturity abruptly rather than gradually, suggesting a lineage of experimentation whose surviving traces are faint at best, discernible only in discontinuities beneath the marble floors and in the differing orientations of earlier precinct walls that predate the imperial rebuild. Remnants that encourage speculation about earlier cultic or civic structures standing on this site for centuries before the dome took shape, each phase leaving architectural clues but no clear narrative. And as scholars examine subtle irregularities in the rotunda's load path, variations in mortar composition, and the enigmatic drainage channels beneath the portico pavement, the evidence complicates the tidy chronology usually applied here, offering proposals ranging from multi-phase Republican sanctuaries to Augustan-era experiments in large-span roofing, though none resolve the lingering tension between the apparent suddenness of the Pantheon's engineering leap and the scarcity of intermediate examples. A tension deepened by the dome's uncanny preservation, which makes the absence of a developmental sequence feel even more conspicuous. And while nothing in the archaeological record demands an age beyond what is traditionally accepted, the quiet persistence of these architectural puzzles invites reflection on how many layers of Roman building practice may have vanished without record, leaving the Pantheon's perfection to stand not as an isolated marvel, but as the most visible survivor of a continuum, now largely erased, so that the structure's calm presence masks the unresolved questions embedded within its foundations, inviting observers to consider whether its true story stretches further back than the surviving inscriptions allow, lingering just beyond the reach of certainty. Ostia Antica. Along the shifting mouth of the Tiber, where the river's slow drift meets the broad light of the Tyrrhenian Sea. The ruins of Ostia Antica extend in quiet, rectilinear patterns that once framed a bustling port, yet now feel suspended between the clarity of Roman urban planning and the deeper, more ambiguous traces that lie beneath its gridded streets. For while the city is conventionally tied to the 4th century BCE and the early republic's maritime ambitions, excavations have repeatedly uncovered structural layers whose materials and alignment do not always conform to later Roman order, hinting at earlier occupations or experiments in harbour settlement that were later overwritten by imperial expansion. Their remnants, surviving only as interrupted walls, mismatched masonry styles, and subfloor anomalies beneath the warehouses and insulae that define today's archaeological map. And as one walks past the quiet facades of the Caseggiato dell'Erario, or through the shadowed arcades of the Aurea Epagatiana, the standard narrative of Ostia as a straightforward Roman port begins to soften for the city's infrastructural sophistication, its complex drainage channels, early use of hydraulic concrete, and unexpectedly advanced shoreline stabilization seems to appear fully formed in the archaeological record, with few surviving intermediary examples to illustrate how such mastery developed over time, leaving researchers to piece together a puzzle in which technological leaps seem more abrupt than gradual. And beneath the Decumanus Maximus, ground-penetrating surveys reveal the ghostly outlines of earlier street alignments diverging slightly from the later orthogonal plan, as though Roman surveyors adapted pre-existing routes whose origins are largely obscured, while deeper cores taken near the ancient coastline show signs of repeated reshaping well before the port's classical flourishing. Layers of human modification interspersed with episodes of flooding or siltation that complicate attempts to reconstruct a linear developmental history. And in certain corners of the site, particularly near the Capitolium and the older sections of the Forum, stone blocks appear reused from prior structures of uncertain date, their weathering patterns and tool marks differing subtly from the later fabric, suggesting a local architectural vocabulary that may have evolved long before Ostia's documented founding, though the surviving fragments are too incomplete to place within a confident framework. And similarly, the so-called Republican castrum, often cited as the earliest major phase, presents inconsistencies in wall thickness and orientation that have led some researchers to question whether it represents a single coherent construction event or a palimpsest of multiple stages, each responding to shifting river channels and changing defensive needs, leaving open the possibility that the site was already a locus of activity before the historical record begins to describe it. Yet, the uncertainties embedded in these layers do not challenge the established chronology so much as quietly complicate it, showing how a port that later became essential to Rome's grain supply may have evolved from a sequence of modest and now largely invisible antecedents, each erased or transformed by subsequent rebuilding, until the Ostia we excavate today appears as both culmination and survivor of longer rhythms of settlement. And as the afternoon sun settles across the well-preserved mosaics of the Baths of Neptune, the silence of the abandoned streets seems to hold an unspoken acknowledgement that the city's visible ruins represent only a fraction of its temporal depth, encouraging the thought that Ostia's origins may stretch further back than the surviving walls attest, not in dramatic contradiction of known history, but in the quieter suggestion that its early phases remain concealed within the river's shifting sediments, waiting for the rare convergence of evidence that might allow its earlier story to emerge more clearly from the layered earth, Hadrian's Villa. Beyond the gentle wooded slopes of Tivoli, where cool springs gather in terraces and the Sabine hills fold softly into one another, the vast sprawl of Hadrian's Villa rests like a fragmented memory of imperial ambition, its colonnades, pools and pavilions scattered across a landscape that seems to have shaped the architecture as much as the architecture once shaped the land. And although its formal creation in the 2nd century CE is securely tied to Hadrian's reign, The site itself carries hints of an earlier spatial logic that predates the emperor's grand design, visible in the uneven orientations of certain substructures, in retaining walls that do not consistently align with Hadrianic geometry, and in water channels whose earliest segments appear older than the villa's refined hydraulic system, as if previous rural installations, villa rustica foundations, agricultural terraces, or even forgotten boundary markers were absorbed or reworked into the later palatial complex. And moving through the quiet corridors of the Canopus, or beneath the vaulted shadows of the Piazza d'Oro, one senses an architectural confidence so advanced in its manipulation of concrete, domes, and integrated landscaping that its maturity feels abrupt, emerging in fully realized forms, with few preserved antecedents in the surrounding region. A circumstance that leaves scholars piecing together an evolutionary chain from fragmentary precedents like Nero's Domus Aurea and scattered bath complexes, while acknowledging that the villa's hydraulic and structural innovations appear in a state of completion that surpasses the visible developmental record. And beneath the villa's more formal layers, excavations have uncovered perplexing traces, such as reused blocks with differing weathering signatures, early drainage features diverging from Hadrianic alignments, and pockets of pottery or wall foundations inconsistent with 2nd century occupation. That point to episodic activity on the site before the imperial project began, though the nature and extent of that activity remain uncertain, complicated by centuries of quarrying and vegetation that have obscured the earliest phases. And the landscape's geological variability adds another layer of ambiguity, for the tufa shelves and travertine seams beneath the villa reveal signs of earlier quarry use, possibly supplying stone to local communities long before Hadrian selected the site. And these irregularities in the bedrock occasionally disrupt the villa's otherwise meticulous symmetry, suggesting that its planners adapted pre-existing cuts or depressions rather than shaping the terrain entirely from scratch. And as researchers study the villa's enormous network of subterranean service corridors, crypto-porticos that weave beneath the surface with surprising irregularity, they encounter sections whose masonry styles subtly deviate from the known Hadrianic repertoire, raising questions about whether earlier tunnels or storage spaces were incorporated into the later design, their original purposes now reduced to scattered hints in mortar seams or unexpected shifts in vault curvature. Yet none of these ambiguities challenge the villa's established chronology so much as expand its context, revealing how Hadrian's vision may have been superimposed upon a landscape already marked by human presence. Its earlier traces largely effaced by the scale of the imperial project, leaving behind only those marginal inconsistencies that resisted complete incorporation. And when evening settles across the ruins, softening the surviving arches and restoring a kind of unity to the villa's dispersed remains, the site seems to offer a quiet acknowledgement that its grandeur was not born from emptiness, but from a place whose earlier rhythms have nearly vanished, inspiring a subtle wonder about how many architectural experiments or rural structures once stood here before being absorbed, erased, or transformed, their faint impressions lingering beneath the monumental surfaces of Hadrian's extraordinary retreat, Verona's arena, set against the gentle curves of the Adige River, where the pale stone of northern Italy gathers an almost luminescent quality under shifting light. The arena of Verona rises from the urban fabric, not as a ruin consumed by time, but as a remarkably intact ellipse, whose calm durability often obscures the uncertainties layered within its origins. For although its construction is traditionally placed in the 1st century CE, aligning it with the mature phase of Roman amphitheatre design, subtle irregularities in its foundational courses and in the surviving outer arches hint at building phases not entirely explained by the standard chronology, with some substructural elements displaying masonry patterns and mortar compositions that do not align cleanly with the arena's later, more uniform fabric. and as one traces the curve of its podium walls or examines the radial vaults that once guided tens of thousands of spectators, the engineering appears so assured, particularly in its load distribution, drainage systems, and carefully calibrated acoustics, that it raises quiet questions about how rapidly Roman builders refined the amphitheatre form, especially when so few transitional examples survive in comparable states of preservation, leaving scholars to wonder how many prototypes have been lost to later rebuilding or simply collapsed beyond recognition. And beneath the arena's polished surface, archaeologists have identified earlier occupation layers, including traces of domestic structures and workshop debris, their orientations diverging subtly from the amphitheatre's axial symmetry, suggesting that the site was once part of a more irregular urban quarter, whose remnants were mostly cleared or incorporated when the arena's foundations were laid, though certain anomalies, such as angled wall segments beneath the northern arc, and an unexpected concentration of reused stone blocks, hint that not all of the earlier cityscape was fully erased, and the geological substrate contributes its own complications, for the region's fine alluvial soils required substantial stabilization. And yet, the arena's foundations appear underpinned by techniques that seem mature from the outset, with gravel packing, drainage channels, and deep-cut footings, executed with a level of uniformity that suggests long-practiced expertise rather than experimental trial, though the scarcity of surviving early amphitheatres prevents a clear assessment of how gradually such methods evolved. And in certain vaulted corridors, where the stone surface holds the marks of ancient tools, inconsistencies in dressing styles and block sizes quietly suggest multiple construction episodes, possibly reflecting repairs, expansions, or adaptations whose records have not survived, leaving only the physical evidence to gesture toward a more complex building history than the single-phase narrative often applied to Imperial Rome's amphitheatres. Yet none of these threads disrupt the established dating so much as contribute to an atmosphere of layered development, in which the arena stands not merely as a triumph of Roman architectural ambition, but as the outcome of earlier urban patterns, geological constraints, and construction practices that may have deeper histories than their visible remnants allow. And as twilight gathers along the upper tiers, softening the sharpness of the surviving arches, and returning a sense of quiet to a structure long shaped by performance and public life, the arena of Verona seems to acknowledge its own partial opacity, its preservation granting extraordinary clarity to its form, while simultaneously emphasizing how much of its earlier story remains concealed within the foundations, inviting a gentle curiosity about the phases of human settlement and architectural experimentation that once shaped the ground upon which the great ellipse now rests. Villa Jovis. High above the sheer limestone cliffs of Capri, where the island's pale terraces descend steeply toward waters that shift from cobalt to silver under passing clouds, the ruins of Villa Jovis cling to the summit with an austerity that mirrors the landscape's dramatic isolation. And although the villa is firmly associated with Tiberius in the early 1st century CE, the site's imposing terraces and intricate water systems contain traces that do not always conform neatly to a single imperial phase. For beneath the later opus reticulatum and brick-faced walls lie retaining structures whose masonry styles differ subtly in orientation and technique, suggesting earlier attempts to anchor habitation or agricultural installations to the mountain's unstable slopes. And as one moves through the villa's fragmented corridors, past the collapsed vaulted halls and the remnants of ceremonial chambers that once surveyed the vast Tyrrhenian expanse, the architectural ambition of the complex seems so complete, so assured in its manipulation of steep terrain, that it quietly raises questions about the developmental path that led Roman engineers to such precision, particularly given the relative scarcity of surviving cliff-top palatial precedents with comparable scale, leaving researchers to infer a lineage of experimentation from scattered coastal villas, many of which survive only as partial foundations or eroded terraces. And at Villa Jovis, the subterranean cisterns, with their careful waterproofing and unexpectedly capacious design, appear to belong to an evolved hydraulic tradition. Yet certain segments, distinguished by variations in mortar, vault curvature, and wall thickness, hint at earlier construction episodes, possibly predating the imperial residence and later integrated into a more extensive water management network when Tiberius expanded the site into its monumental form, though the incomplete nature of these layers makes definitive attribution elusive. And geological studies reveal that portions of the bedrock beneath the villa were quarried or levelled before the main building campaign, with cut marks and trenches that do not perfectly align with the later architectural grid, suggesting preparatory works whose purposes remain partly speculative, perhaps connected to earlier lookout posts, agricultural uses, or modest dwellings long since dismantled, leaving only the altered stone as evidence of their presence. And in the villa's eastern sectors, where the remains are more fragmentary, archaeologists have noted reused blocks bearing weathering patterns inconsistent with first-century construction, as though earlier structures from elsewhere on the island were harvested to stabilize the ambitious terraces, their original contexts now obscured by centuries of adaptation. Yet none of these features challenge the prevailing chronology so much as enrich it, offering a view of Villa Jovis not as a creation imposed upon untouched rock, but as a culmination of long-standing engagement with the island's rugged topography. An engagement that may stretch back through undocumented phases of rural occupation or early military presence, each leaving traces that were partially absorbed into Tiberius's expansive vision. And as the evening wind sweeps across the summit, carrying the muted sound of waves rising far below, the broken walls of the villa begin to blend into the cliffside once more, their commanding silhouette softened by distance, and the site seems to acknowledge the quiet uncertainty surrounding its earliest layers, hinting at a deeper, less visible history embedded within the mountain, its fragments offering only enough evidence to suggest that the story of human presence on these heights may reach further back than the imperial chapter for which the ruins are best known. Etruscan tombs. Across the broad wind-swept plateau of Cerveteri, where low grasses ripple over tufa shelves shaped by ancient volcanic forces, the Etruscan tombs emerge from the earth not as isolated monuments, but as a vast necropolis whose plan resembles a subdued mirror of a living city. Its domed chambers, carved corridors, and street-like paths preserving a spatial memory of a culture that flourished long before Rome's ascent. Yet even within this relatively well-dated Iron Age and archaic context, the site contains subtleties that complicate a straightforward narrative. For beneath the familiar rock-cut facades and tholos-like interiors lie earlier phases of excavation and construction, whose tool marks, weathering patterns, and sometimes altered orientations suggest a more gradual evolution of funerary architecture than the surviving examples alone reveal, with some of the oldest tombs at Banditaccia showing irregularities in chamber geometry and ceiling curvature that point to experimental stages now otherwise missing from the archaeological record. And while the Etruscans' capacity to shape tufa into complex domestic-like interiors is well attested, certain structural features, particularly in the deeper multi-room tombs, demonstrate a sophistication in weight distribution and moisture control that seems to appear in near-complete form, raising quiet questions about the earlier technical precedents that must once have existed but are now eroded, filled or quarried away, leaving only the refined iterations to survive. And within some of the larger tumuli, layers of backfill, altered floor levels, and sections of masonry that differ in cutting style reveal that these monuments were not static creations, but evolving sites, modified across generations, occasionally expanding beyond the initial plan in ways that hint at shifting ritual or social needs. While other anomalies, such as partially buried stair passages or chambers sealed long before the necropolis reached its classical extent, suggest episodes of abandonment or repurposing not easily integrated into the broader chronology. And geological studies underscore the complexity further, for the tufa beds themselves vary in hardness and moisture content across short distances, affecting both preservation and carving technique. And in some instances, earlier excavations appear to have taken advantage of naturally occurring cavities or erosion pockets that were later reshaped into formal tombs, though the degree to which natural features influenced the necropolis's earliest phases remains difficult to determine. And scattered among the more elaborate complexes are simpler, rough-cut cavities, whose orientations diverge from the later, more organized layout, their modest scale and inconsistent tooling, leaving open the possibility that Cerveteri's funerary landscape developed from small, perhaps family-based burial zones that were gradually unified into a more monumental arrangement as the settlement grew in regional prominence, a process largely invisible now due to the dominance of the later, more architectural tombs. And at the edges of the necropolis, where weathering has softened the once crisp forms, certain cuttings and partially collapsed corridors hint at structures whose original shapes are no longer recoverable, their fragmentary nature quietly suggesting that the surviving tombs represent only the best preserved phase of a much longer tradition of rock-cut construction, a tradition whose earliest chapters may have faded as older chambers were repurposed, re-excavated, or buried beneath later expansions. Yet none of these hints require revising the recognized timeline so much as broadening it, acknowledging that the necropolis's present clarity masks earlier and more tentative stages of development that remain difficult to trace. For erosion, ancient looting, and shifting soil layers have obscured much of the evidence that would illuminate how the earliest Etruscan builders experimented with form before achieving the balanced proportions seen in the later tumuli. And as dusk settles over the plateau, softening the outlines of the mounds until they seem to merge with the natural undulations of the land, the necropolis takes on a contemplative stillness, its carved interiors hidden beneath earth and grass. And in that quiet, the site seems to gesture toward the limits of our knowledge, suggesting that long before these monumental tombs were carved with such confidence, earlier hands may have shaped the same stone, in ways now largely erased, leaving only subtle discontinuities and scattered remnants to imply a deeper, more gradual story of architectural emergence within the Etruscan world. Nuraghe Santu Antine. Amid the rolling plains and basaltic ridges of northern Sardinia, where the land rises in gentle swells shaped by ancient volcanic flows, the Nuraghe Santu Antine stands with a deliberate solidity that has weathered more than 3 millennia, its massive basalt blocks interlocked without mortar, to form a central tower and flanking bastions that command the surrounding landscape with a quiet, enduring presence. Yet even within the well-established Bronze Age context of the Nuragic culture, the structure carries subtle ambiguities that complicate any neat interpretation of its origins, for beneath its carefully fitted masonry lie earlier construction phases discernible in slight shifts of alignment, differing block sizes, and interior passages that appear to have been modified or expanded over time, as though the nuraghi evolved through successive building episodes, rather than emerging fully formed in a single monumental effort. And moving through its corbelled chambers, where the cool shadows soften the sharpness of the basalt, one encounters an architectural confidence in load-bearing technique that suggests a mature tradition of stone construction, but the scarcity of preserved proto-nuragic structures makes it difficult to trace the incremental steps that must once have led to such mastery, leaving scholars to infer a gradual technical evolution from fragmentary remains scattered across the island. Rock shelters, modest stone huts, and collapsed foundations that hint at experiments in corbelling long before the great towers rose. And beneath the packed earth surrounding Santu Antine, excavations have revealed traces of earlier habitation layers, and post holes that predate the main tower, their patterns only faintly preserved, suggesting that the site may have held significance before the basalt blocks were first hoisted into place. While other features, such as reused stones with differing weathering signatures or channels cut into bedrock beneath the inner courtyard, indicate episodes of alteration whose purposes remain partly obscured, possibly tied to shifting settlement strategies or ritual practices that left few durable records. And the geological substrate itself adds complexity, for the basalt used in construction exhibits variations in density and mineral content, implying that multiple quarry sources were employed, some perhaps linked to earlier building efforts in the region, and the precision with which these heavy blocks were shaped and positioned hints at a logistical sophistication for which direct evidence survives only in the finished architecture. The intermediate tools and techniques largely eroded or lost to time. And around the outer perimeter of the nuraga, remnants of a village extend outward in patterns that do not always align perfectly with the central structure, suggesting that the settlement may have grown organically, absorbing earlier domestic layouts or adapting to pre-existing pathways, with certain circular foundations showing signs of rebuilding that complicate attempts to establish a single coherent chronology. And while none of these observations challenge the Bronze Age dating of Santu Antine, they collectively invite reflection on how much of the Nuragic world's architectural story remains invisible, transmitted only through its most monumental survivors, and leaving the subtler, formative stages difficult to reconstruct, their traces muted by centuries of reuse, soil accumulation, and the gradual collapse of less durable structures. Yet as the evening light descends, casting long shadows across the basalt towers and emphasizing the precision of each interlocked stone, the Nurag seems to hold within its silence an acknowledgement of its layered past, its present form resting atop earlier and less understood moments of human occupation, inviting a quiet curiosity about how many iterations of design, settlement, and symbolic meaning may have preceded the imposing architecture that now stands as one of Sardinia's most enduring prehistoric monuments.
Cumaean Sibyl Cave. Carved deep into the volcanic tufa of the Phlegraean fields, where fumaroles exhale faint warmth and the land bears the restless imprint of ancient calderas, the Cumaean Sibyl's Cave stretches in a trapezoidal corridor whose geometric precision has long distinguished it from the more irregular rock-cut chambers of the surrounding Acropolis. And while its conventional attribution to the late Archaic or early Roman periods grounds it firmly within known architectural traditions, the tunnel's unusual plan, its tapering walls, consistent gradient, and carefully engineered apertures suggests a level of intentionality that has prompted ongoing debate about earlier phases of modification. For beneath the smoother, later tool marks lie faint indications of more primitive cutting, their patterns obscured by centuries of reworking, yet still visible in shadowed recesses where weathering has exposed slight discontinuities in texture and alignment. And as one follows the descending passage toward its forks and lateral chambers, the structure reveals an interplay between natural geology and human intervention that seems to reflect multiple stages of excavation, with some segments adhering closely to the grain of the tufa, while others diverge in directions that hint at shifting functions or evolving ritual needs, though the absence of securely datable debris from the earliest strata leaves these hypotheses suspended between inference and modest uncertainty. And above the vaulted ceiling, hidden from view, geological surveys have detected cavities and partially collapsed voids whose origins remain ambiguous, some likely natural, others possibly the remnants of earlier quarrying or exploratory tunnels predating the more formal architectural shaping, yet all contributing to the difficulty of reconstructing a clear sequence of construction. And the corridor's famous triangular profile introduces another layer of complexity. For while similar forms exist elsewhere in the region, particularly in Hellenistic and Roman military works, their appearance at Cuma presents a level of refinement
that seems to emerge almost fully realized, with few surviving transitional examples to trace the gradual adoption of this distinctive design, leaving scholars to consider the possibility that earlier prototypes once existed, but have since been destroyed by seismic shifts, landslides, or later building campaigns on the Acropolis. And near the passage's terminal chambers, where light wells pierce the rock with an almost architectural rhythm, certain cuttings appear older than the surrounding masonry, their angles less regular, their surfaces more weathered, as though the later builders adapted pre-existing niches or tunnels rather than carving entirely anew. A pattern echoed in small sections of irregular floor levelling that hint at earlier ground surfaces now partially obscured by subsequent modifications. And outside the cave, where terraces descend toward the ancient harbour, scattered foundations and collapsed walls reveal a broader landscape of occupation whose phases overlap in ways not always cleanly defined, suggesting that the cave may once have been part of a larger complex of sanctuaries, storage areas, or defensive installations whose earlier stages are now fragmentary, their relationships to the corridor inferred but not conclusively established. Yet the known chronology remains undisturbed, for nothing in the evidence requires assigning the cave to an age outside the established historical framework, and the subtle discontinuities instead deepen the sense that the site participated in a long tradition of adaptation, with each generation modifying inherited spaces to suit new contexts, leaving behind a layered architectural palimpsest rather than a single monolithic creation. And as the dim light thins toward the cave mouth, where the landscape opens again to the sweeping arc of the Bay of Naples, the passage seems to recede into its own ambiguity, offering neither confirmation nor contradiction of the speculations that surround its earliest shaping, but instead a quiet acknowledgement that its present form rests upon earlier, less visible interventions whose traces persist only as faint irregularities in stone, inviting contemplation of how many stages of excavation and reuse may have preceded the enigmatic corridor that survives today beneath the shifting volcanic terrain of Cuma. Etruscan Via Cava, threading through the wooded hills of southern Tuscany, where shadows settle gently across ravines carved by ancient streams, the Etruscan Via Cava cuts into the volcanic tufa with a depth and narrowness that give the passage the quiet atmosphere of a corridor suspended between earth and sky, its steep walls rising in places higher than a two-story building, their surfaces bearing generations of tool marks that speak to long periods of use and modification. Yet the sequence of that shaping remains partly obscured, for while many of these sunken roads are attributed to the late Etruscan and early Roman periods, subtle variations in wall texture, channel depth, and ceiling-like overhangs hint at earlier phases of carving, whose purposes may have differed from the later transport routes they eventually became. And as one walks along the serpentine paths where light filters unevenly through the narrow openings above, the engineering appears both deliberate and enigmatic, with drainage grooves, side niches, and occasional carved steps integrated into the walls in ways that suggest an evolving knowledge of how to manage seasonal runoff and stabilize the friable tufa, though the earlier stages of this expertise are difficult to trace due to erosion, landslides, and the repeated reworking of surfaces that have smoothed away the signatures of the first cutters. And beneath loose soil, at the base of certain trenches, archaeological probes have detected traces of earlier ground levels and compacted surfaces that imply prolonged activity before the final depth of the corridors was achieved, while in other sections, faint remnants of cross-cutting passages indicate that the routes may have shifted or branched over time, their original alignments now only partially recoverable. And the geological context adds further complexity, for the tufa layers in this region vary markedly in hardness and degree of volcanic consolidation,
producing stretches where the walls are intricately carved, and others where the stone appears rougher, almost as though earlier stages of excavation followed naturally weakened seams before later builders regularized the surfaces, a process that may account for the irregular heights and sudden wall expansions that appear along otherwise consistent corridors. And around the Via Cava networks of Sovana, Pitiliano, and Sorano, scattered tomb entrances and chamber openings punctuate the walls at varying elevations, their inconsistent placement hinting at a relationship between funerary architecture and the roadways that evolved over centuries rather than forming part of a single unified plan. With some tombs predating the current depth of the trenches, while others seem to have been cut into the walls after the roads reached their present form. And in certain passages, where the walls grow exceptionally tall and moss gathers in the crevices, researchers have noted subtle shifts in orientation that suggest the cutters may have been following pre-existing paths, perhaps simple foot trails or erosion channels, before deepening them into more formal corridors, though evidence for these earliest itineraries remains sparse, inferred mainly from topographic alignment and scattered fragments of compacted soil. Yet these complexities do not push the Via Cava beyond the established Etruscan and early Italic timeframes, but instead reveal how the routes likely grew through repeated adaptation, with each generation responding to local needs, geological constraints, and shifting patterns of settlement, gradually carving the trenches deeper and refining their features while leaving only faint traces of the earliest efforts. And as dusk settles in the narrow spaces where the sky tightens overhead into a ribbon of fading light, the Via Cava take on an introspective stillness, their towering walls standing as the cumulative imprint of centuries of modification. And in that quiet vertical landscape, the suggestion lingers that long before the passages reached the dramatic forms we see today, earlier hands may have shaped the same stone in ways now almost entirely erased, leaving only subtle irregularities to hint at a deeper, more layered history embedded within the carved ravines. Domus Aurea. Beneath the shifting heart of Rome, where the Palatine slopes ease toward the valley once filled by Nero's extravagant lake, the Domus Aurea extends in a labyrinth of buried chambers whose surviving frescoes, stuccoed vaults, and hidden courtyards offer only a partial glimpse of the vast palace that briefly reshaped the city in the 1st century CE. Yet even within this well-documented historical framework, the substructures preserve subtleties that complicate a simple narrative of creation and abandonment. For beneath the later brick-faced reinforcements and Flavian infill lie earlier walls and floor levels whose orientations do not always align with Nero's ambitious plan, suggesting that pre-existing buildings, possibly portions of Claudian or even older Domus, were incorporated, modified, or levelled in ways that left faint archaeological signatures now compressed between layers of reconstruction. And as one moves through the light-well chambers of the East Wing, where the remains of intricate vaulting designs reveal an architectural confidence in the manipulation of concrete and space, the technical sophistication appears so fully realized that it invites questions about the developmental stages that preceded it. For while other Julio-Claudian structures hint at similar experimentation, many earlier examples have been lost to fire, rebuilding, or deliberate erasure, leaving the Domus Aurea to stand as one of the earliest surviving large-scale demonstrations of the techniques that would later flourish in imperial bath complexes and monumental rotundas. And below the palace floors, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of earlier retaining walls, drainage channels, and foundation cuts that differ in mortar composition and block size from Nero's works, their incomplete preservation hinting at pre-Neronian occupation across the Oppian slopes, though their relationship to the palace remains partly speculative due to the fragmented nature of the surviving fabric. And certain chambers, particularly those partially collapsed or filled with ancient debris, display discontinuities in wall bonding, as though earlier rooms were adapted rather than wholly replaced, with some vaults exhibiting subtle variations in curve and thickness that may correspond to multiple construction phases, each responding to the topographical challenges created by the slopes and the underlying geological strata of compacted tufa and clay. And the famous octagonal hall, with its innovative dome and oculus, rests upon foundations whose earlier strata include irregular cuttings and fill deposits that do not clearly relate to the later geometry, raising the possibility that the palace's boldest architectural experiments were layered atop a more complex and less understood arrangement of earlier structures, though no evidence firmly challenges the established dating. And above the buried palace, where Trajan's baths were later constructed, enormous loads were imposed upon the surviving chambers, prompting extensive reinforcement that further obscured the original layout, sealing some passageways and embedding earlier floor levels within new supporting walls, so that the Domus Aurea now exists as a palimpsest of imperial ambition, structural necessity, and geological negotiation. Yet, despite its dramatic history, the surviving evidence does not point beyond the accepted Neronian period, but instead enriches it, showing how the palace, often imagined as a singular imposition upon cleared ground, was in fact entangled with earlier urban layers, their partial remains shaping the constraints and possibilities of Nero's design, even as subsequent emperors reshaped the terrain once more. And in the dim interiors, where faint natural light filters through restored skylights and reveals the enduring brilliance of pigments long hidden underground, the Domus Aurea seems to acknowledge its own layered opacity, offering neither a complete nor a chronological clarity, but instead a quiet suggestion that the visible ruins represent only one moment in a longer architectural dialogue between the city's evolving topography and the ambitions of those who built upon it, leaving open the gentle possibility that beneath the palace's celebrated innovations lie deeper and less visible traces of Rome's earlier architectural experiments, preserved only in fragmentary foundations and subtle irregularities that continue to soften the boundaries of its known history.
Mainstream archaeology insists our ancestors built their world slowly, relying on brute force and simple tools. Yet, carved into the remote, towering cliffs of a single mountainous landscape lies physical evidence that utterly defies this narrative. In this video, we are bypassing the textbooks to look at the cold, hard engineering of structures that should not exist. We will examine an ancient metropolis, mathematically sculpted in reverse from the sky down, where millions of tons of excavated stone simply vanished from the historical record. We will confront a vertical monolith where heavy masonry was impossibly hoisted up a sheer 130-foot void without the physical space or mechanical leverage required to survive the lift. And we will uncover the remnants of a 13-story subterranean world hollowed out in absolute secrecy that boasts an understanding of structural load and fluid dynamics that vastly outpaces its assigned era. The physical mechanics left behind in the stone point to a reality far more complex than we are told. The math simply does not add up, and the true methods used to conquer this rock remain a glaring anomaly. Let's look at the evidence. Wieliczka. How did a Bronze Age civilization carve an entire city out of a single, solid sandstone cliff without leaving behind the millions of tons of excavated rock? Welcome to Wieliczka, an ancient rock-hewn metropolis in Georgia that defies its own technological timeline. Mainstream archaeology insists this vast complex of temples, avenues, and intricately coffered ceilings was chipped away slowly with rudimentary hand tools. But the sheer volume of missing stone and staggering structural precision point toward an entirely different reality. This sprawling stone labyrinth sits high on the rocky left bank of the Makvari River in eastern Georgia. Long before modern machinery, industrial diamond drills, or heavy quarrying techniques, an entire society decided to shape a mountain into a metropolis. Mainstream historians place the earliest traces of human occupation at this site around 1000 BC. That is the dawn of the Iron Age in this region. At a time when most civilizations across the globe were still mastering basic structural masonry, stacking rough-hewn stones on top of one another to build simple defensive walls. the builders of Wieliczka were doing the exact opposite. They were deliberately removing material to create massive empty spaces. They were sculpting a high-functioning city out of the living bedrock. Over the centuries, this site evolved rapidly. It became the beating heart of the Kingdom of Kartli, also known as Caucasian Iberia. This was not a mere military outpost or a collection of crude, desperate caves meant for temporary shelter. It was a thriving, powerful, pagan, religious, and political center. Ancient kings ruled from these stone halls. Priests conducted elaborate, secret rituals in carved temples that echoed with the sounds of antiquity. The city stood as an unyielding testament to human willpower until the relentless winds of cultural shift swept through the Caucasus. The site began a slow, inevitable decline after the widespread adoption of Christianity in the region around 337 AD, as the old pagan temples were repurposed or abandoned. It held on as a strategic fortress for centuries more, ultimately facing total ruin and abandonment following the brutal, sweeping Mongol raids in 1240 AD. But the timeline of who lived there, who conquered it, and when they left only scratches the surface of the true mystery. The real enigma lies in the physical stone itself, and the seemingly impossible methods required to shape it. Consider the sheer, staggering mechanics of monolithic architecture. When you build a conventional structure, you start with a foundation. You lay out the floor, you raise the support walls, and finally, you construct the roof. You build from the ground up, fighting gravity every step of the way, adding material piece by piece. Wieliczka shatters this fundamental paradigm of construction. Here, the builders worked in reverse. They built from the sky down, stand inside the massive, cavernous chamber known to historians as the Prince's Building. Look up. You are not looking at a heavy roof placed onto supporting walls. You are looking at an intricately carved, beautifully coffered ceiling that was sculpted out of the solid cliff face before the floor beneath your feet even existed. To achieve this, ancient engineers had to perfectly calculate the dimensions, the load-bearing stress points, and the exact geometric placement of towering support pillars before a single piece of the lower chamber was hollowed out. They had to visualize the empty space trapped inside the dark, suffocating mountain and flawlessly extract the rock to reveal it. There is absolutely no margin for error in top-down monolithic carving. You cannot simply patch a mistake with mortar. You cannot replace a cracked stone. If you miscalculate the thickness of a vaulted ceiling while carving it, or if you weaken a load-bearing column, the entire mountain collapses on top of you, burying the workers instantly. Yet, chamber after vaulted chamber displays an astonishing level of mathematical precision, symmetry, and enduring structural integrity. And that brings us to the most glaring physical anomaly of the entire 8-hectare complex: the missing rock. To carve a multi-level city of this magnitude out of solid bedrock requires the removal of millions upon millions of cubic feet of stone. A project of this unprecedented scale should be accompanied by massive, sprawling debris fields. There should be artificial mountains of quarry tailings stretching for miles across the Georgian landscape, the discarded, shattered rubble of a hollowed-out metropolis. Those debris fields simply do not exist. The immediate surrounding landscape is starkly devoid of the sheer volume of waste rock that must have been violently extracted from the cliff face. It is as if the interior of the mountain simply vanished into thin air. Furthermore, the manipulation of the stone goes far beyond simple, brute force excavation. The site features a spectacular, rock-cut, Hellenistic-style theatre. Unlike standard Roman amphitheatres built by stacking heavy, perfectly cut stone blocks into a geometric semicircle, this theatre was carved entirely by removing material from the earth. The result is an acoustic environment that rivals the greatest freestanding auditoriums of antiquity. A mere whisper at the focal point of the stage carries perfectly to the highest carved tier. To achieve this level of acoustic perfection by blind excavation, tuning the auditory resonance of solid bedrock by chipping away at it in total darkness, borders on the miraculous. Conventional archaeologists and skeptical historians offer a grounded, if somewhat tedious, explanation for these staggering achievements. They point directly to the specific geology of the region. The cliffs of Wieliczka are composed of local sandstone. By geological standards, sandstone is a relatively soft and porous rock. It is highly susceptible to the elements, to wind and water erosion, and, crucially, it is relatively easy to carve. The mainstream narrative argues that no advanced technology, no lost engineering techniques, and no grand master plans were necessary. Instead, they propose a story of generational, sheer brute force labor. According to this view, legions of laborers, armed with simple iron and bronze pickaxes, stone chisels, and wooden mallets, chipped away at the cliff face day after day, year after year, century after century. The complex simply grew organically, a slow and agonizing expansion driven by the sheer, expendable manpower of successive generations. As for the millions of tons of missing rock, the skeptics point to the Mount Kavari River, flowing swiftly at the base of the cliffs. The universally accepted theory is that the excavated debris was simply carried to the edge, cast into the rushing waters below, and washed away by the strong currents over hundreds of years, neatly erasing the physical evidence of the excavation entirely. It is a neat, tidy explanation that satisfies the textbooks. But when subjected to the harsh, unforgiving light of modern structural engineering, the soft stone theory begins to fracture. And fracture is exactly the problem. While it is undeniably true that sandstone is soft enough to carve with primitive hand tools, that very softness makes it incredibly volatile and dangerous to manipulate on a massive scale. Sandstone is highly prone to internal fracturing, hidden geological fault lines, and sudden, catastrophic shearing. Imagine standing beneath a ceiling of solid rock that weighs thousands of tons, striking the central load-bearing pillar beside you with a heavy, blunt iron pickaxe. The blunt force trauma of thousands of repetitive, uncontrolled strikes would send violent kinetic shockwaves through the fragile, porous stone. One heavy, errant blow could trigger a microscopic internal fissure. That fissure propagates in an instant. The critical load distribution fails, and the multi-ton ceiling caves in without warning. To hollow out massive, interconnected chambers using brute force impact tools without triggering a catastrophic structural failure requires an intimate, almost superhuman understanding of kinetic energy and load distribution. Basic, blind trial and error over generations would have left the cliff face a collapsed, unstable ruin of rubble. Instead, these hollowed-out chambers survived the immense tectonic stresses of countless regional fault line shifts. They stood strong and defiant until a massive, devastating earthquake finally caused structural damage in 1920 AD. The survival of the city for millennia proves a level of structural foresight that simple generational digging cannot possibly account for. Furthermore, the sheer cohesiveness of the city planning destroys the idea of random, slow expansion. Wieliczka is not a chaotic, winding honeycomb of desperate caves. It features wide, perfectly linear avenues. It boasts a highly sophisticated, secret water tunnel bored precisely through solid bedrock, connecting the city centre directly to the river below. It contains a complex, interlocking drainage system designed to channel rainwater away from the vulnerable sandstone structures, preventing erosion from the inside out. You do not achieve perfectly aligned avenues and interlocking subterranean water systems through centuries of disorganized chipping. You achieve it with a master blueprint, a cohesive blueprint conceived and executed by minds that viewed the mountain not as an obstacle, but as a blank canvas. We are left staring at a sheer cliff face that challenges our fundamental understanding of ancient capabilities. If a society living in 1000 BC possessed the staggering architectural foresight to plan an entire city, the mathematical genius to carve it from the sky down, and the logistical mastery to erase millions of tons of debris from the historical record, our timeline of human innovation is dangerously incomplete. It forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. If an earthquake-resistant, bedrock-carved metropolis like Wieliczka can stand in plain sight, casually miscategorized as the work of primitive tools and simple labor, what other masterworks of ancient, impossible engineering have simply eroded back into the earth, their secrets washed away by the rivers of time? Katskhi Pillar. How do you hoist tons of stone up a sheer 40-meter cliff face using only primitive ropes from 900 AD? Mainstream historians claim isolated monks simply dragged the materials by hand to build a stone sanctuary in the sky. Yet the physical reality of the Katskhi Pillar in western Georgia completely shatters this overly simple narrative. Looking at this towering, impossible limestone monolith, the basic engineering math and the sheer physical exertion required simply do not add up at all. To truly understand the sheer impossibility of this structure, you have to stand at the base of the Katskura River Gorge. Rising violently out of the rolling green landscape is a massive, natural limestone monolith. It shoots 40 meters straight up into the air, 130 feet of dead vertical rock. It looks less like a geological formation and more like a massive, petrified tree trunk holding up the sky. But it is what sits on the very top of this natural skyscraper that defies all logical belief. Mainstream archaeology attributes the ruins crowning this summit to a radical early Christian ascetic sect known as the Stylites. These spiritual extremists believed that the absolute best way to distance themselves from earthly temptations and to draw physically closer to God was to live atop elevated pillars. According to accepted historical records, the construction of the massive Katskhi complex occurred over a century, somewhere between 900 AD and 1000 AD. For hundreds of years, it served as an isolated, functioning hermitage. It was a place of extreme meditation and punishing physical deprivation. The site remained active until the chaos and violence of the Ottoman invasions swept through the Georgian region around 1400 AD. Facing complete destruction, the pillar was abruptly abandoned. Whatever wooden ladders or intricate rope systems were used to access the top slowly rotted away into dust, and the site was left totally untouched by human hands for over 500 years. It remained an unconquered phantom of the gorge until 1944 AD. In that year, a seasoned Georgian mountaineering team finally scaled the rotting, treacherous rock face. What they found waiting for them at the summit was not the simple, primitive camp of a lone, fanatical madman. It was a complex, highly developed architectural footprint that immediately raised terrifying questions about the true capabilities of medieval engineering. The logistics of vertical construction on the Katskhi Pillar are nothing short of an absolute nightmare. The rock itself is not sloped or tiered. It is an overhanging, sheer vertical drop. In many places, the top of the pillar is actually wider than the base, meaning any object hoisted up from the ground would hang out in the open air, spinning and swaying violently in the unpredictable gorge winds. Moving heavy, mathematically precise cut limestone blocks up a 40-meter void requires a sophisticated staging area. It requires a stable base of operations, secure scaffolding, and massive mechanical advantage. None of this exists anywhere near Katskhi. The summit complex is the true anomaly. When the mountaineers mapped the top in 1944 AD, they found a surface area of merely 150 square meters, yet crammed onto this tiny, terrifying platform in the sky is a fully realized stone church. There is a stone crypt containing human remains. There are 3 distinct, walled hermit cells. There is a defensive curtain wall built right to the very edge of the abyss. And, incredibly, beneath it all, a stone-lined wine cellar. Think about the sheer, crushing weight of these structures. We are not talking about simple wooden huts. We are talking about tons of quarried stone, massive timber support beams, heavy mortar, forged ironwork, and dense roofing materials. Moving heavy stone requires leverage, but a 150 square meter surface area offers absolutely no room for complex counterweights. There is zero space to deploy large teams of men to pull on heavy ropes. There is no flat, stable foundation upon which to build a wide base crane capable of lifting heavy masonry out of the vertical void without tipping over. The workspace constraint is absolute and unforgiving. One wrong step backward while pulling a heavy load, one slight loss of balance, means a 130-foot fatal drop onto the rocks below. Furthermore, consider the human element of surviving the build itself. How did the initial architects survive the blistering Georgian summers and the freezing, snow-battered winters atop a barren, wind-scoured rock while trying to construct the very shelter they needed to stay alive? It is a paradox of survival and engineering. The timeline demands rapid construction to survive the lethal elements, but the perilous geography demands a brutally slow, meticulous, and dangerous lifting process. Conventional archaeologists offer an explanation rooted entirely in extreme religious devotion and agonizingly slow progress. The mainstream view suggests that the stylite monks did not use advanced technology, massive cranes, or lost engineering techniques. Instead, they relied on sheer, fanatical willpower and the limitless currency of time. Over decades, using only simple wooden winches, highly stressed hemp ropes, and rudimentary scaffolding pegged directly into the rock face, they slowly hauled up building materials block by agonizing block, beam by heavy beam. The prevailing theory argues that the ascent was initially managed by carving small, shallow niches into the stone, inserting heavy wooden pegs, and inching upward into the sky. This theory gained some traction based on a chilling artifact discovered during that initial 1944 AD expedition. Dangling near the top of the monolith, heavily rusted and deeply embedded into the limestone, was an ancient iron chain. Archaeologists believe this massive chain was the primary lifeline for the ascetics. A primitive, terrifyingly sheer hand-over-hand climbing method used to ferry smaller items, building tools, and perhaps even their daily rations of food and water up and down the vertical expanse. It is a grueling, horrifying explanation. It paints a picture of men willingly enduring daily terror, relying on absolutely nothing but absolute faith and bare-handed friction to build their sanctuary. It is a deeply romantic and brutal image, but when subjected to rigorous mechanical analysis, the conventional theory begins to completely fracture. The physical evidence required to support this massive, slow-moving construction project is simply missing from the site. If extensive wooden scaffolding was used to build a secure winch system or to construct a safe, weight-bearing lifting path up the side of the rock, there should be extensive anchor holes drilled into the lower and middle sections of the limestone. A heavy construction project of this magnitude, lasting for decades and supporting tons of moving rock, would leave a definitive, undeniable scar on the face of the pillar. Yet, these deep anchor points are largely absent. The sheer sides of the pillar are relatively smooth and untouched, offering absolutely no evidence of the heavy, load-bearing scaffolding required to safely lift tons of quarried stone without killing the builders. Then there is the insurmountable problem of the weight-to-force ratio. Hauling heavy masonry vertically using 10th century friction pulleys requires immense downward pulling force at the top of the lift. A few starving, ascetic monks, weakened by religious fasting and permanently exposed to the brutal elements, simply would not possess the raw body weight or the physical strength to act as a counterweight for half-ton blocks of limestone. Even with a complex pulley system, the mechanical friction of pulling coarse hemp ropes over wooden dowels at a strict 90-degree angle would eventually snap the lines, or worse, pull the lightweight men straight off the edge of the cliff. The basic math of the human body against the dead weight of the stone simply does not work. Because the vertical engineering required borders on the mathematically miraculous, some structural historians and alternative researchers point to a vastly different possibility: the lost geography theory. This theory suggests that the physical landscape of the Katskhi Gorge was vastly different in 900 AD than it is today. Proponents of this theory argue that a natural land bridge, or perhaps a massive secondary rock spire of equal height, once existed directly next to the Katskhi Pillar. If a neighboring peak stood just a few meters away, the monks would never have needed to lift heavy stones straight up from the valley floor. They could have transported the materials up the much gentler, rolling slopes of the adjacent rock, built a simple horizontal timber bridge across the narrow gap, and simply walked the heavy materials directly onto the top of the pillar. Once the massive stone church and the hermit cells were completely finished, this secondary spire, or land bridge, either collapsed during a violent seismic earthquake or eroded away over the intervening centuries, leaving behind only the impossible vertical monolith we see today. It is a theory born entirely out of logical necessity, because without a horizontal transfer, the vertical lift remains a completely unexplained mechanical anomaly. Today, the Katskhi Pillar stands as a silent, imposing sentinel over the gorge. A modern monk lives at the base of the rock, and occasionally climbs a newly installed, highly secure steel ladder to pray at the reconstructed summit, keeping the ancient, ascetic tradition alive. But the ancient stones themselves hold tight to their original secrets. The physical evidence is undeniable. The massive church was built. The heavy stones were moved up into the sky. The iron chain was forged and hung over the abyss. Yet, the mechanical reality of how a handful of isolated, starving men executed a masterclass in impossible vertical engineering without the aid of modern hydraulics, secure scaffolding, or heavy machinery remains deeply fractured. Whether they possessed a completely lost understanding of mechanical leverage, or whether the earth itself provided a temporary bridge that has long since vanished into dust, the pillar demands a massive suspension of disbelief. It leaves us staring up at the sheer rock face, wondering about the true, hidden limits of human ingenuity. If a few isolated hermits could conquer the impossible math of the Katskhi Pillar using nothing but rope, stone, and bone, what other miracles of ancient construction are we falsely writing off as simple religious devotion? Varja. How does a medieval kingdom, allegedly using basic iron tools and sheer willpower, hollow out an entire mountain to build a 13-story subterranean city in just a few decades? Mainstream history claims Vardzia was carved to protect Queen Tamar's people from invaders starting around 1185 AD. Yet, the structural precision, complex plumbing, and the rapid excavation of thousands of tons of solid rock without leaving massive debris fields utterly defy standard medieval capabilities and accepted archaeological timelines for manual labor. Look at the sheer, vertical cliffs of Erusheti Mountain in southern Georgia. Today, the cliff face is an open honeycomb of caves, a skeletal remnant of something far greater. But to understand the true scale of this anomaly, you must picture the mountain before the devastating earthquake of 1283 AD. Before the earth violently tore the front off this mountain, there was nothing to see. No windows, no balconies, no grand entrances. From the outside world, it was just another imposing, impassable rock face. Yet hidden completely inside the stone was a bustling, fully functional metropolis. The mainstream historical narrative tells us this colossal undertaking was initiated by King Georgi III and finished during the golden age of his daughter, Queen Tamar, around 1185 AD. The purpose was survival. The brutal Mongol hordes were sweeping across the known world, and the Georgian people needed an impenetrable sanctuary. The official story is that they decided the safest place to be was not behind walls of stone, but inside the stone itself. They engineered an invisible fortress, a covert sanctuary accessed only by a single, hidden tunnel plunging down to the Matkvari River. It was a masterclass in defensive architecture. But when you look at what was actually built inside that mountain, the narrative of a desperate, panicked excavation begins to fracture. This was not a collection of crude caves scratched out by a terrified populace. Vardzia was a marvel of advanced urban planning, boasting over 6,000 individual apartments carved both horizontally and vertically through the rock. We are talking about 13 distinct levels, 13 stories of unsupported subterranean architecture. It possessed a grand throne room, extensive wine cellars, meeting halls, bakeries, apothecaries, and the magnificent church of the Dormition, all meticulously excavated from the solid interior of the mountain. Imagine the logistical nightmare of just the lighting and ventilation. How do you supply breathable air and light to thousands of people living deep inside a solid rock matrix without suffocating the workforce during construction? Then, there is the staggering reality of the water system. Survival in a siege requires a limitless supply of fresh water. The architects of Vardzia did not rely on carrying buckets up a hidden tunnel. Instead, they designed and carved a highly sophisticated 3.5-kilometer aqueduct system deep within the stone. This system operated on incredibly precise gravitational gradients, tapping into natural mountain springs to deliver clean water to the deepest levels of the complex, and even irrigating terraced agriculture on the exterior slopes. To achieve this level of fluid dynamics and pitch calculation without modern surveying equipment or laser levels is an engineering anomaly that commands profound respect. But the most impossible element is the structural integrity of the complex itself. When you carve a honeycomb of thousands of interconnected rooms stacked 13 stories high, you are fundamentally compromising the structural integrity of the mountain. The weight of the rock above is immense. Removing that much internal mass without the entire mountain collapsing under its own crushing weight requires a deep understanding of load-bearing geometry, compression, strength, and geology. A single miscalculation on the lower levels would have brought millions of tons of stone crashing down, burying the city forever. Yet, the architects flawlessly mapped out a three-dimensional grid in absolute darkness. They knew exactly how much stone to remove and how much to leave as load-bearing pillars. This was not trial and error. This was master engineering. Conventional archaeology offers a rational, pragmatic explanation for this monumental achievement. Skeptics and mainstream historians point directly to the geology of Erusheti Mountain. The rock here is composed of volcanic tuff. This is a relatively soft, porous, and highly workable stone. It is not the unforgiving density of granite or basalt. Because of the nature of volcanic tuff, medieval iron tools would have been highly effective. Furthermore, the Georgian kingdom during the reign of Queen Tamar was experiencing an unprecedented golden age. The royal treasury was overflowing, allowing for the mobilization of a massive, highly motivated, and religiously devoted workforce. The conventional view asserts that there is no need to invoke lost technology. A massive labor force, working relentlessly shift after shift, funded by a wealthy kingdom and driven by the existential threat of Mongol annihilation, simply brute forced the excavation. By chipping away at the soft stone day and night over a period of 40 to 50 years, the city of Vardzia slowly took shape. It was a triumph of medieval willpower and rudimentary tools. But when you apply the cold, hard mechanics of physics and logistics to this explanation, massive cracks begin to appear. The volcanic tuff may be softer than granite, but hollowing out an entire city still requires the removal of millions of cubic feet of solid rock. Where did it all go? Remember the primary purpose of Vardzia. It was an invisible fortress. Its survival depended entirely on absolute secrecy to hide from the Mongol invaders. If thousands of workers were hacking away at the inside of a mountain, they had to dispose of an astronomical volume of stone debris. In a standard excavation, this creates a massive, highly visible spoil tip. Dumping millions of pounds of crushed rock outside the hidden entrance or into the river below would have instantly betrayed the location of the secret city to any passing scout. Furthermore, the sheer dust created by carving volcanic tuff in enclosed, unventilated spaces would have been lethal to a massive workforce. How do you secretly dispose of an entire mountain's worth of interior mass without leaving a trace, while keeping your workforce alive in the dark? The logistics of this stealth disposal remain a glaring, unanswered question. Then, there is the relentless pressure of the timeline. Mainstream history condenses the bulk of this construction into the few decades of Queen Tamar's reign, starting around 1185 AD. Think about the sheer volume of precision carving required. We are not just talking about removing bulk material. We are talking about sculpting structurally sound, interconnected levels, complete with perfectly pitched water channels, vaulted ceilings, and complex ventilation shafts. To accomplish this within a single generation using only hand tools, the coordination of labor in tight, dark tunnels would have been an absolute nightmare. The spatial constraints alone dictate that only a few men could work at the rock face at any given time. You cannot simply throw 10,000 men at a narrow tunnel to make the work go faster. The math of the timeline drastically conflicts with the physical limitations of the subterranean workspace. Finally, consider the ultimate test of Vardzia's structural genius. In 1283 AD, a catastrophic earthquake struck the region. The seismic force was so violent that it sheared the entire front face off Erusheti Mountain, ripping away the outer wall of stone and exposing the hidden city to the world. But look at what survived. While the natural cliff face collapsed, the deep internal structure, the complex, human-engineered geometric honeycomb of the city, remained entirely intact. The mountain broke before the city did. This level of earthquake resilience is staggering. It points to a sophisticated understanding of seismic engineering, acoustic resonance, and structural shock absorption that vastly predates the medieval era. They didn't just dig holes. They engineered a subterranean structure capable of withstanding planetary violence. Today, Vardzia stands open to the sky, an exposed ant farm of ancient human ingenuity laid bare by a tectonic cataclysm. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capabilities of our ancestors. The official narrative asks us to believe that a desperate, fleeing populace casually executed a masterclass in structural engineering, fluid dynamics, and stealth logistics in a matter of decades. But the stones suggest a different story. A story of a civilization that possessed knowledge we have yet to fully understand. If a medieval kingdom could hollow out a mountain, install a highly advanced, gravity-fed plumbing system, and build a 13-story metropolis in absolute secrecy, we are left with a lingering, haunting question: what other staggering architectural feats, what other impossible subterranean worlds are still hiding quietly beneath the earth, just waiting for the rock face to fall away?